My name is Geraldine Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. 2 weeks from now, I will stand in the center of a crowded Detroit art gallery and watch security guards escort my wealthy, prominent parents out the front doors. I will watch my father lose his pristine reputation in front of the local automotive elite he spent his life trying to impress. I will watch my mother grasp at her silk scarf, her face drained of color, as the people she invited turn their backs on her. I will stand there, wearing a tailored suit paid for with the money they tried to steal from me, and I will finally be in the picture. But right now, in the moment I am about to describe, I know none of that. Right now, I am standing in that same gallery, alone, staring at a brass plaque mounted beneath a breathtaking oil painting. The smell of oil paint and polished concrete fills my lungs. The silence in the private viewing room hums in my ears. It is a profound, isolating silence. The painting shows an 8-year-old girl in a sunlit garden, her dark hair tangled, her eyes staring directly at the viewer with a defiant clarity. I know those eyes because I see them in the mirror every morning. But my gaze drifts downward, catching on the cold metal plaque, reflecting the harsh track lighting. The engraved letters spell out my name, Geraldine Rodriguez, followed by the years 1998 to 2016, and then one final word, deceased. I reach out and press my index finger against the engraving, letting the cold metal bite into my skin. Looking at a beautifully framed declaration of your own death does something to your mind. It makes you question your own gravity. I am 28 years old. I am breathing. My heart beats a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Yet here, in the heart of the city art district, my death is documented in brass. My parents did not just ignore me. They legally erased me. Before I take you back to the phone call that started this nightmare, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments how old you are and where you are listening from today, because I read every single one. If you have ever felt like a ghost in your own family, you are already part of this. Subscribe to Intimately Told Stories and let me show you how a ghost learns to haunt the people who buried her. 72 hours before I stood in front of that plaque, I was sitting at the Granite Island in my parents' Grand Rapids home. The morning sun poured through the sheer curtains, catching the condensation on my mother's iced tea glass. A bead of water rolled down the smooth side of the glass and pooled on the stone counter. Patricia Rodriguez demanded perfection in her home. The air always smelled of fresh lemon polish and expensive floral diffusers. I was visiting for the weekend, sorting through a box of historical archive files for a freelance project, trying my best to stay out of the way. I preserve lost history for a living, piecing together forgotten public records for local museums. It is ironic now, thinking about how much time I spent preserving the past while my own family was actively deleting mine. That was my role in this house, staying out of the way, keeping my head down, being the quiet disappointment. Then the landline rang. Nobody called the landline anymore. It sat on the marble counter near the refrigerator like a relic. Patricia picked up the receiver with a manicured hand, her diamond ring catching the morning light. "Hello?" she said, her tone carrying that practiced suburban warmth she reserved for charity board members and country club neighbors. I kept my head down, dragging a yellow highlighter across a line of text in my folder. But the silence that followed pulled my attention. The kitchen grew suffocatingly quiet. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the next room. Patricia turned her back to me, but I saw her spine go rigid. The ice in her glass rattled as she set it down too hard on the granite. The color drained from her neck, leaving her skin pale and drawn. Her knuckles turned stark white as her grip tightened on the plastic receiver. From across the island, I could hear the faint, staticky timbre of a man on the other end of the line. "We are finalizing the exhibit," the voice bled into the quiet room. "We are calling regarding the portrait of your daughter." Patricia slammed the phone down onto the cradle. The sharp crack of plastic echoed off the tile floor. I set my highlighter down. My throat felt uncomfortably dry. "Who was that?" I asked. She did not turn around. Her chest rose and fell in short, shallow intervals. She grabbed a sponge and began scrubbing a spotless section of the counter next to the sink. "Telemarketers," she said, her voice thin and breathless. "A scam. People trying to sell garbage." Her lie was brittle. It shattered the moment it hit the air. She scrubbed harder the sponge, squeaking wetly against the stone. "You need to pack up your papers, Geraldine," she said without looking at me. "Your father is having guests over later, and I cannot have this clutter everywhere." I did not argue. I slid my files into my bag. My pulse quickened with a strange, creeping dread. The way she avoided my gaze, the way her hand shook as she wrung out the sponge, told me everything I needed to know. That was no telemarketer. I slung my bag over my shoulder and left the kitchen, stepping into the main hallway. The corridor stretched toward the front door, lined with heavy cherry wood frames. It was the visual history of the Rodriguez family. I walked slowly, my boots making no sound on the thick runner rug. I stopped and studied the glass. There was my brother Mateo, in a sharp tuxedo, at an automotive gala in downtown Detroit, holding a champagne flute. Mateo steering a sailboat on the blue waters of Traverse City, his hair blowing in the wind. Mateo smiling at his high school graduation, holding a diploma like a trophy. My parents flanked him in every shot, beaming with pride, their smiles practiced and bright. Frame after frame, year after year, a pristine timeline of success and joy. I was not in a single one. For 2 decades, I had accepted Patricia's cold dismissals. "You blinked, sweetie. You slouch too much. You just do not photograph well." She would say it with a tight smile, patting my cheek before handing the camera to someone else. I had internalized it. I believed my absence was merely an aesthetic choice to preserve their flawless image. I was the introverted one, the girl with the messy hair and the ink-stained fingers, the background character in their vibrant lives. But tracing the edges of the frames, looking at the negative space where I should have been standing, the truth shifted in my mind. The air in the hallway felt heavy, pressing against my chest. The hallway was not a collection of memories, it was a curated narrative. They had not cropped me out of vanity. They had systematically erased me to fit a story they were telling the world. And a voice on the phone asking about a portrait had just threatened to tear that story apart. I looked back toward the kitchen. I could hear the water running. Patricia was still scrubbing the same spot. I crept back toward the doorway, pressing my back against the wall. The landline sat on the edge of the counter, just within reach. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I held my breath, stretched my arm out, and pressed the caller ID button. The digital screen lit up with a Detroit area code and a name: Vanguard Fine Arts. I memorized the 10 digits, pulled my hand back, and slipped out the front door into the crisp Michigan air. I sat in the driver's seat of my rusted sedan, the engine off, the steering wheel cold under my palms. My car looked out of place, parked next to the luxury SUVs lining my parents' driveway. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar, staticky voice answered. "Vanguard Fine Arts, Felix speaking." My throat felt dry, like I had swallowed sand. "Hi," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You just called my parents' house in Grand Rapids. You asked about a portrait of a daughter." There was a pause on the line, a shifting of papers. "Yes," the man said. "I spoke with a woman who hung up rather abruptly. I assume I reached the wrong household. We are trying to locate the estate representatives for the late painter." "My grandfather," I whispered. The word felt foreign on my tongue. My grandfather was an artist who died when I was very young. My parents never spoke of him. They claimed he was a drifter, a man who squandered his life and left them with nothing but headaches. Yes, Felix said, his tone shifting from professional to cautious. We are preparing a retrospective of his work. The centerpiece is a portrait he painted of his granddaughter. It is a remarkable piece. We simply need to verify the subject's details for the exhibit catalog. I stared at the suburban houses lining my parents' street, the manicured lawns, the perfect facades, a pristine neighborhood hiding a hollow family. I am the granddaughter, I said. My name is Geraldine Rodriguez. I could hear Felix inhale sharply. Geraldine, he asked. Yes, I said. Another pause, heavier this time. Miss Rodriguez, Felix said, his voice dropping an octave. The records provided to the gallery state that the subject of this painting passed away 10 years ago. The cold seeped through the car windows, settling into my bones. I looked back at my parents' front door. The heavy oak wood, the polished brass handle. A fortress built on a mountain of lies. I am very much alive, I told him. Felix let out a slow breath. The sound vibrated through the phone speaker. Then, Miss Rodriguez, I think you need to come to Detroit. Walking back into the house felt like stepping onto a stage where I no longer knew my lines. The heavy mahogany front door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a pristine, temperature-controlled lie. The air smelled of roasted rosemary and rich red wine. From the formal dining room, the clinking of crystal and low, practiced laughter echoed down the hallway. My family was already seated for dinner. I slipped my phone into my pocket, the heat of the battery burning against my thigh, a physical reminder of the conversation I just had with Felix. I took a slow breath, forcing my shoulders to drop, and walked into the dining room. The table was set with Patricia's imported porcelain. Hector sat at the head, swirling a dark vintage in his glass. My father was a man who took up oxygen just by entering a room. He built Rodriguez Logistics from a single warehouse into a regional empire, and he ran his household with the same sterile, ruthless efficiency. To his right sat Mateo. My older brother wore a tailored navy blazer, his posture relaxed, his teeth flashing in a bright, easy smile. He was the golden heir, the face of the company, the son who could do no wrong. I pulled out my chair at the far end of the table, sitting on the periphery, just as I always did. Ah, there she is, Hector said, his tone flat. Glad you could join us, Geraldine. We were just toasting your brother's promotion. Patricia smiled, passing a silver platter of roasted vegetables toward Mateo. Vice President of Regional Distribution, she said, her voice fluttering with pride. He closed the Chicago account this morning. Such a milestone. I murmured a hollow congratulation, keeping my eyes on my plate. I watched Mateo slice into his lamb, basking in the adoration. My parents looked at him with an intensity that bordered on reverence. For 20 years, I thought they favored him because he was charismatic and business-minded, while I preferred dusty archives and solitary research. But looking at them now, under the glow of the chandelier, the dynamic shifted in my mind. They did not just favor Mateo. They needed him to be the sole focus. My presence was an inconvenience, a loose thread in their perfect tapestry. I picked up my fork, the silver heavy and cold in my hand. So, I began, my voice unnervingly steady. I was thinking about driving over to Detroit next week. There is a new exhibit opening downtown. Some historical restoration work I might want to pitch a freelance piece on. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The clinking of silverware stopped. Hector slowly lowered his wine glass. The dark liquid settled in the bowl. Patricia froze, holding a linen napkin halfway to her mouth. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. I saw raw, unfiltered panic flash behind my mother's eyes. Detroit, Hector repeated the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. Why on earth would you go to Detroit, Geraldine? You have plenty of local records to sort through here. It is a big gallery opening, I said casually, pushing a piece of lamb across my plate. Vanguard Fine Arts. I hear the collection is remarkable. Patricia dropped her napkin onto the table. The fabric landed with a soft thud. Vanguard? She said, her voice sharp and brittle. That is downtown. It is not safe. You have no business wasting gas driving across the state for some pretentious art show. You barely make enough on those little freelance projects to cover your groceries. I looked up, meeting her gaze. I do all right, I said. I value my independence. A short, harsh laugh erupted from across the table. Mateo leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Independence, he repeated, wiping his mouth. Come on, Jerry. Stop playing the starving artist. I turned to my brother. What does that mean? Mateo smirked, tossing his napkin onto his empty plate. It means you play at being independent while living in an apartment Dad co-signed for. You drive a car Dad pays the insurance on. You are not off the grid, little sister. Dad basically owns you. You would be on the street without him. The words hung in the air. A cold shiver mapped its way down my spine. Mateo delivered the line as a joke, a piece of arrogant sibling banter meant to put me in my place. But looking at Hector, I saw the truth of it. My father was not laughing. He was staring at me, his dark eyes unblinking, his expression a wall of stone. He did not contradict Mateo. He took a slow sip of his wine, letting the silence stretch, confirming every syllable my brother just spoke. They were not funding my life out of parental generosity. They were funding it to keep me tethered, to keep me manageable. I did not take the bait. I forced a tight, polite smile, nodded, and took a bite of my food. The conversation shifted back to logistics and Chicago contracts, but my mind was racing. If the gallery in Detroit thought I was dead, someone had to have provided them with documentation. Someone orchestrated a legal fiction to keep my portrait hidden. And Hector Rodriguez never left a job to chance. He kept records of everything. 3 hours later, the house plunged into darkness. Patricia had retired to the master suite with a headache. Mateo drove back to his downtown condo. Hector sat on the back patio smoking a cigar while listening to a late-night business podcast. I stood in the upstairs hallway waiting. The scent of tobacco drifted through the open screen door downstairs. I slipped off my shoes, leaving them by my bedroom door, and walked in my socks down the carpeted stairs. My destination was the home office, a room situated at the back of the house near the garage. It was a space I was strictly forbidden from entering as a child. Even now, as an adult, crossing the threshold felt like trespassing. I grasped the brass doorknob, turned it slowly, and slipped inside, shutting the heavy oak door behind me. The room smelled of old paper leather and scotch. Moonlight filtered through the wooden blinds, casting long, narrow shadows across the Persian rug. I did not dare turn on the desk lamp. I pulled a small penlight from my pocket, flicking it on. A narrow beam of white light illuminated the immense cherry-wood desk. I checked the drawers. Unlocked. Filled with mundane tax returns and shipping manifests. Then I turned my attention to the corner of the room. A tall, steel filing cabinet sat flush against the wall. I pulled the top handle. Locked. I tried the second. Locked. Hector thought he was the only one in the house with specialized skills. But working as a historical archivist means you spend a lot of time in forgotten basements dealing with rusted locks on century-old donation trunks. You learn how to coax a stubborn mechanism into yielding. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keychain. Attached to it was a small flat tension wrench and a standard steel pick I kept for tricky archive boxes. I knelt on the rug, sliding the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying light pressure with my thumb. I slid the pick inside, feeling for the tiny brass pins. 1, 2, 3. The fourth pin offered resistance. I held my breath, the quiet ticking of the hallway clock echoing in my ears. If Hector walked in right now, there would be no excuse I could offer, no lie that would cover this. I pushed the pick upward. The pin set with a faint, satisfying click. The cylinder turned. I pulled the handle and the top drawer slid open on silent tracks. I ran the penlight over the thick, hanging folders. They were perfectly organized, labeled with neat printed tabs. Real estate, life insurance, trust distributions. My fingers trick manila folder tucked all the way in the back. The tab read, Hollister. Hollister, my grandfather's last name. I pulled the heavy folder out, laying it flat on the carpet. I opened the cover. The first document was a letter typed on thick cream parchment paper, dated a few months ago. It bore the letterhead of an independent legal executor based in Detroit. I skimmed the paragraphs, my heart hammering against my ribs. The executor was writing to Hector. The language was formal, but laced with warning. I am writing to inform you that the Vanguard Fine Arts Gallery intends to proceed with the retrospective exhibition. As the executor of the Hollister estate, I have authorized the display of the final canvas titled The True Heir. Your previous claims regarding the subject's status hold no jurisdiction over the physical artwork left in my care. My grandfather painted me. He named it The True Heir, and Hector had been trying to stop it. I dug deeper into the folder, pulling out a stapled packet of legal documents bearing the name of Hector's corporate attorney. I read the header, Motion for Emergency Injunction and Order of Destruction. I scanned the dense legal jargon, the words blurring together, before snapping into terrifying focus. Hector was petitioning a local judge to seize the painting from the Detroit Gallery, citing emotional distress and fraudulent representation. But it was the final page that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a timeline. A court date set for an expedited ruling. Hector was not just trying to hide the painting. He was demanding the court grant him immediate physical custody of the canvas so it could be incinerated before the public unveiling. I shined the penlight on the date listed for the gallery opening. The Vanguard exhibit was scheduled to open its doors next Friday, exactly 7 days from today. If Hector won this injunction, the portrait would be burned. The only visual proof that my grandfather valued me, the only piece of history tying me to the Hollister name, would turn to ash. My parents had 20 years to perfect their lie. I had exactly 1 week to tear it down. I carefully folded the documents, took out my phone, and snapped high-resolution photos of every single page, making sure the flash was turned off. The digital shutter clicked softly in the dark. I put the papers back exactly as I found them, closed the drawer, and re-locked the cylinder. I stood up, the muscles in my legs aching from the tension. I switched off the penlight, plunging the room back into shadows. I now knew the what and the when. What I needed to find out next was the why. Why would a father spend untold thousands in legal fees to burn a painting of his own daughter? The answer was waiting in Detroit, and I was going to find it before the clock ran out. The tires of my sedan hummed a monotonous rhythm against the asphalt of Interstate 96. I had left a vague handwritten note on the kitchen island before dawn, claiming a sudden archival emergency back at my apartment. I doubted Hector or Patricia would even read it. The sun crested over the Michigan horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the highway as I drove east toward Detroit. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I had not slept a single minute. The documents I photographed in my father's office burned in my mind. 7 days. That was the timeline. 1 week until a judge could grant Hector the legal right to incinerate the only piece of my grandfather I had left. The transition into the city was jarring. Gone were the manicured lawns and sterile facades of my parents' suburban fortress. Downtown Detroit greeted me with towering brick warehouses, iron fire escapes, and the restless hum of a city that understood survival. I navigated the one-way streets until I found Vanguard Fine Arts. The gallery occupied a repurposed auto manufacturing plant, its vast windows reflecting the gray morning sky. I parked the car, took a steadying breath, and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The interior was a cavern of polished concrete and pristine white walls. The air tasted of ozone and expensive espresso. A man stood near the reception desk, reviewing a clipboard. He wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp dark shirt. His silver hair swept back with meticulous care. He looked up as my boots clicked against the floor. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone carrying a practiced detachment. "I am Geraldine Rodriguez," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "We spoke on the phone yesterday." The man froze, his posture shifted, dropping the formal gallery owner facade. He set the clipboard down, staring at me with a piercing, analytical gaze. He studied the slope of my jaw, the unruly dark hair falling over my shoulders, the set of my eyes. A slow exhale escaped his lips. "I am Felix," he said, extending a hand. "I must admit, Miss Rodriguez, part of me believed I would be meeting an imposter today. The legal threats your father has hurled at this gallery over the past 6 months have been nothing short of theatrical." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and human. "Why does he want the painting destroyed?" I asked. Felix gestured for me to follow him down a long corridor. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man, but he was also deeply paranoid. He knew his family. He knew what they valued. Before he died, he bypassed your parents. He did not leave his masterworks in a standard family trust. He placed them under the control of an independent, eccentric executor, a man who operates far outside the reach of the Rodriguez Logistics legal team." We walked past empty white rooms, waiting for exhibits. Felix kept his voice low, the acoustics of the space turning his words into sharp whispers. "The executor contacted us a year ago to arrange this retrospective. Your father immediately filed injunctions claiming the art was stolen property. When we produced the legal chain of custody, Hector shifted tactics. He claimed the centerpiece portrait violated family privacy because it depicted a deceased child." My chest tightened, restricting the air to my lungs. "They told the executor I was dead." Felix nodded, stopping in front of a pair of heavy steel doors. "If the subject is deceased and the estate claims emotional distress, the court might rule to suppress the exhibit. Your father has spent a fortune trying to prevent anyone from seeing what is behind these doors." Felix pushed the handles down. The heavy doors swung open, revealing a private viewing room. Track lighting cut through the dim space, illuminating a towering canvas that leaned against the exposed brick wall. I stepped inside, the ambient noise of the gallery fading into a dull, rushing static in my ears. It was breathtaking. The oil painting stood nearly 6 feet tall. The subject was an 8-year-old girl sitting in a sunlit garden, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her dark hair was tangled, wild, and untamed. But it was the eyes that held the room. They stared directly at the viewer, filled with a defiant, sharp clarity. I recognized those eyes immediately. I reached out my fingers, stopping an inch from the dried oil paint. The scent of linseed oil and turpentine lingered in the room, unlocking a door in my mind I thought had been sealed forever. The memory hit me with a visceral, physical force. I was 8 years old, sitting on a wooden stool in a drafty studio that smelled of sawdust and rain. My grandfather stood before an easel, his apron stained with 1,000 different hues. My mother had just called the studio phone, screaming at him for keeping me too long, complaining that my messy hair and paint-stained clothes would ruin their country club dinner. I sat on the stool, shrinking into myself, wishing I could disappear into the floorboards. My grandfather set his palette down. He walked over, kneeling so we were eye to level. He placed a rough, calloused hand over mine, wrapping my small fingers around a wooden paintbrush. "Never let them paint over you, Jerry," he whispered, his voice a gravelly rumble that vibrated in my chest. "They will try to make you fade into the background because they are afraid of bold colors. But you are the canvas, not the background. You belong in the light." The memory faded, leaving me standing in the cold gallery with tears burning the edges of my vision. For 20 years, Hector and Patricia told me I did not photograph well. They pushed me to the edges of family portraits and eventually out of the frame entirely. I thought it was vanity. I thought they were just ashamed of the introverted, awkward daughter who preferred archives to automotive galas. I looked at the canvas. My grandfather saw me. He painted me with a presence that commanded the entire room. He named the piece "The True Air." Felix stepped up beside me, his hands clasped behind his back. "It is a masterpiece," he said quietly. He refused to sell it during his lifetime. The executor informed me it was intended to be unveiled specifically on your 28th birthday. "My birthday was last week," I murmured, keeping my eyes on the painted girl. Felix reached into the inner pocket of his blazer. He withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. The edges were marked with dried adhesive residue. When the executor delivered the canvas to us, this was taped securely to the back of the wooden stretcher bars. He instructed me to hand it directly to the subject of the painting once her identity was verified. I took the envelope. It carried a strange, dense weight. My name was written across the front in my grandfather's familiar, jagged handwriting. I slid my thumb under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a small, folded piece of parchment paper. Wrapped inside the paper was a heavy brass key. The metal felt ice cold against my palm. The top of the key was stamped with a series of numbers and the insignia of a prominent Detroit credit union. I unfolded the parchment. There were only 2 lines written in black ink. "The art is the distraction. The truth is in the vault." I stared at the brass key. My pulse thrummed a chaotic beat against my throat. The puzzle pieces shifted, rearranging themselves into a terrifying new picture. Hector was not spending thousands in legal fees just to burn a painting out of spite. He was trying to burn a breadcrumb. He was trying to sever the chain of custody between my grandfather's legacy and my own identity. The portrait was a beacon designed to draw me out. My grandfather knew my parents would try to hide my existence. He knew they would crop me out of their flawless narrative. He left the painting with an independent executor, knowing a gallery opening would create a public record they could not easily scrub. He used the art to bypass their control and hand me this key. My parents had not merely erased me to protect their social standing. They were erasing me from a paper trail, the trust, the real estate, the historic properties I spent my career archiving for poverty wages while my brother drove luxury cars. Hector and Patricia were hoarding a fortune that did not belong to them, and my continued existence was the only threat to their stolen empire. Felix watched me, his expression guarded but curious. "Are you all right, Miss Rodriguez?" he asked. I gripped the brass key until the jagged edges dug into my palm, grounding me in the present reality. Hector thought he had 7 days to incinerate the evidence. He thought I was still the quiet daughter shrinking into the background of his immaculate house. "I am fine, Felix," I said, my voice harder, colder than it had ever been. "Can you keep this painting secure for a few more days?" "We have advanced security," he replied. "But if your father wins that injunction, the court-martials will seize it. I cannot defy a judge." "He will not win the injunction," I said, turning away from the canvas and heading toward the heavy steel doors. I slipped the key into my pocket. "Where are you going?" Felix called out, his footsteps echoing behind me. I did not look back as I pushed through the doors into the bright lobby. "To the bank." The drive to the Detroit Credit Union took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. The brass key burned a hole in my pocket. Every red light felt like a physical barrier, every passing car a potential spy sent by Hector. The logic of it was absurd, but paranoia has a way of rewriting reality. The sky above the city was a bruised gray, promising snow that had not yet fallen. I parked 3 blocks away, terrified someone might recognize my sedan. The cold wind whipped off the Detroit River, biting through my thin jacket as I walked toward the imposing limestone facade of the financial institution. The interior of the credit union was hushed, a cathedral of polished marble and whispered transactions. The smell of old paper and industrial floor cleaner hung in the air. I approached a teller, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Barbara. I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket and laid it on the counter. The metal clicked sharply against the glass. "I need to access a safe deposit box," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Barbara glanced at the key, then up at me. Her smile was practiced polite. "Certainly, miss. I will need your identification and the account number." I handed her my driver's license. "The account number is stamped on the key." She took the license, typing my name into her terminal. The silence stretched. The rhythmic clicking of her keyboard sounded abnormally loud. I watched her face, bracing myself for the moment her expression would change, for the moment she would tell me the box had been emptied or that my access was denied. Instead, she nodded. "Right this way, Miss Rodriguez." She led me past the teller stations, through a heavy steel door, and down a narrow, carpeted hallway. The air grew cooler the further we walked. We entered the vault, a room lined with hundreds of small rectangular metal doors. It smelled of rust and stale air. Barbara stopped in front of a box near the bottom left corner. She inserted her master key into one lock and gestured for me to use mine. I slid the brass key into the slot. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. Barbara pulled the long metal drawer out, carrying it to a small, private viewing room adjacent to the vault. "Take your time," she said, pulling the door shut behind her. I stood alone in the small, windowless room. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting a harsh white light on the metal drawer. I stared at it, my breathing shallow. This was it. The truth my grandfather had hidden from Hector and Patricia. The truth they were willing to destroy a masterpiece to keep buried. I reached in and pulled out a thick manila folder. The cardboard was crisp, untouched by time or moisture. I set it on the small table and opened the cover. The first document was a last will and testament printed on heavy legal paper. The date at the top indicated it had been filed the year before my grandfather died. I skimmed the dense legal jargon, my eyes searching for familiar names. Hector and Patricia were mentioned once, in a clause explicitly stating they were to receive nothing. The document cited their complete lack of integrity as the reason for their exclusion. I turned the page. The next section detailed the assets of the Hollister Trust. My breath caught in my throat. My grandfather was not just an artist. He was a quiet, shrewd investor. The trust held the deeds to 4 commercial properties in downtown Detroit, including the building that currently housed Vanguard Fine Arts. It held vast tracts of undeveloped timberland in the Upper Peninsula, and it held a portfolio of historic residential properties in Grand Rapids, properties I had spent my career archiving public records for, completely unaware they belonged to my own bloodline. The total estimated value listed at the bottom of the page was $12 million. I traced the numbers with my fingertip. $12 million. All of it left entirely, unequivocally to his sole grandchild, Geraldine Rodriguez. I sat back in the chair, the cold metal pressing against my spine. I was a multi-millionaire. I had been a millionaire for 10 years while I struggled to pay rent on a tiny apartment, while Hector generously covered my cell phone bill, while Patricia criticized my freelance income over dinner. They had watched me struggle, knowing all along that I owned the very ground they walked on. But how? How had they kept this hidden? How had they prevented the executor from transferring the assets to me? I dug deeper into the folder, my hands shaking. Behind the will was a secondary packet of documents. These were newer, the paper wider, the ink sharper. The header read, "Waiver of Inheritance and Transfer of Rights." I read the paragraphs, the legal language dense and suffocating. The document stated that upon reaching the age of majority, the beneficiary, Geraldine Rodriguez, willfully and permanently surrendered all claims to the Hollister Trust, transferring full ownership and administrative control to Hector and Patricia Rodriguez. My eyes snapped to the bottom of the page. The date listed was my 18th birthday. Below the date was a signature line, and sitting on that line in blue ink was my name. I stared at the signature. My heart hammered a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. The letters spelled my name, but they were not mine. The loops on the G were hesitant, too rounded. The tail of the Z dragged downward, lacking my usual sharp stroke. The pressure of the pen was uneven, as if someone had meticulously traced the letters, trying desperately to mimic a signature they had studied for hours. It was a blatant forgery. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over me. They did not just hide the will. They fabricated a legal waiver to steal the entire estate. They committed fraud on a massive scale, forging my signature the very day I turned 18. I touched the forged ink. The emotional betrayal I had felt in the gallery, the sting of being cropped out of family photos, crystallized into something dense and unbreakable. This was no longer about parental neglect. This was a crime. Hector and Patricia had stolen $12 million, and they had used my name to do it. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opening the camera app. I photographed every single page, making sure the focus was sharp, the text legible. The flash reflected off the glossy legal paper. I photographed the forged signature 3 times, capturing the hesitant loops, the uneven pressure. This was the evidence. This was the smoking gun that would destroy Hector's pristine empire. I placed the documents back in the folder, sliding it into the metal drawer. I locked the box, returning the master key to Barbara. I walked out of the credit union, the cold Detroit wind hitting my face. The fear that had gripped me on the drive over was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Hector thought he had perfectly executed a multi-million-dollar theft. He thought his quiet, introverted daughter would never find the paper trail. He thought his forged waiver was an airtight seal on his stolen fortune. But Hector made a mistake. He left a breadcrumb. He let my grandfather paint a masterpiece, and he let that masterpiece lead me straight to the vault. I sat in my car, the engine idling, the heat blasting against my frozen hands. The forged waiver was the key. If I could prove the signature was fake, if I could find the notary who stamped that fraudulent document, I could unravel the entire trust. I could reclaim my inheritance and watch Hector lose everything. But proving a forgery after 10 years would require more than just photographs on a cell phone. It would require a legal team. It would require finding the notary, and, most importantly, it would require confronting the one person in my family who might actually tell me the truth. I pulled my phone out, bringing up my contact list. I stared at the name glowing on the screen. Mateo, my golden brother. The vice president of regional distribution. The son who lived in a luxury downtown condo and drove European sports cars. The brother who mocked my independence at the dinner table. Did Mateo know? Did he know his lavish lifestyle was funded by my stolen inheritance? Was he a naive beneficiary or a willing co-conspirator? I needed to test him. I needed to see his reaction when I mentioned the bank documents. His response would tell me if I had an ally in this fight or if I was truly entirely alone. I hit the call button. The phone rang 3 times before his voice, bright and confident, answered. "Hey, Jerry," he said. "What is up?" "Hey, Matt," I said, keeping my voice light casual. "I am actually in Detroit right now. I have a gap before my next archival meeting. Do you have time for a quick coffee?" There was a brief pause. "Detroit?" he asked. "I thought you were looking into that art exhibit." "I am," I lied smoothly. "The meeting is near Vanguard Fine Arts. I just thought we could catch up." "Sure," he said, his tone relaxing. "Meet me at the roasting plant on Woodward in 20. My treat." I hung up the phone, tossing it onto the passenger seat. I put the car in drive, pulling out into the chaotic Detroit traffic. The coffee date was a trap, a careful, calculated test to see exactly where my brother stood. I drove toward Woodward Avenue, the image of the forged signature burning brightly in my mind. Hector and Patricia thought they had buried me under a mountain of fake legal documents. They were about to find out that ghosts do not stay buried forever. I pulled my sedan into a metered spot on Woodward Avenue, the engine ticking as it cooled in the crisp Detroit air. The roasting plant was a sleek industrial coffee shop, favored by the downtown corporate crowd. Large windows offered a clear view of the interior. I could see Mateo already inside, sitting at a high-top table near the back. He looked entirely in his element. He wore a fitted charcoal sweater over a crisp white collar, a silver watch catching the light as he typed on his sleek laptop. Mateo was 29, only 18 months older than me, but we could not have looked more different. He had inherited Hector's commanding presence and Patricia's sharp, photogenic features. He was the golden child, the vice president of regional distribution, the son destined to inherit the Rodriguez logistics empire. I was the introverted archivist, the quiet disappointment who preferred old documents to networking events. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the edge of the brass key. The image of the forged signature burned brightly in my mind. Hector and Patricia had stolen my inheritance. But what role did Mateo play? Was he a naive beneficiary, blissfully ignorant of the crimes funding his lavish lifestyle? Or was he a willing participant? I pushed through the glass door, the smell of roasting beans and expensive cologne washing over me. "Jerry!" Mateo called out, raising a hand. His smile was bright, perfectly practiced. "Over here!" I wove through the crowded tables, taking the stool opposite him. "Hey, Matt. Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," he said, closing his laptop. "I can always make time for my little sister. So, what's going on? You sounded a bit mysterious on the phone." I ordered a black coffee, keeping my expression neutral. "Nothing mysterious, just I had some free time before my meeting and wanted to catch up." Mateo chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Catch up, right. Because we do that so often. Look, Jerry, if you need cash, just say so. I know freelance archival work isn't exactly lucrative. I can spot you a few hundred." The condescension in his voice was a familiar sting. For years, I had accepted his pity, believing it was the best a flawed, unphotogenic sister could hope for. But today, his arrogance felt different. It felt like an insult delivered from a stolen throne. "I don't need cash, Mateo," I said smoothly. "Actually, I came across some interesting paperwork recently. I thought you might know something about it." He took a sip of his cappuccino, his dark eyes studying me over the rim of the cup. "Paperwork? What kind of paperwork? I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. Old bank documents, Hollister Trust records. The change in his demeanor was instantaneous. Mateo's hand jerked. The ceramic cup slipped from his fingers, clattering against the saucer. Hot coffee splashed across the table, staining the pristine white napkin. "Shit," he muttered, grabbing a handful of napkins to soak up the spill. His movements were frantic, uncoordinated. The relaxed, confident vice president vanished, replaced by a panicked, cornered animal. I watched him, my heart pounding, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The test was over. He knew. "Hollister Trust," he repeated, his voice tight, lacking its usual easy cadence. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found a file in Dad's office," I lied, keeping my gaze locked on his. "And then I visited a credit union vault here in Detroit." Mateo froze, a damp napkin crumpled in his fist. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin pale and drawn. He looked around the coffee shop, his eyes darting toward the other patrons, suddenly hyper-aware of our surroundings. "You went into a vault?" he asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. How did you get access?" "I have the key, Matt," I said softly. "The key my grandfather left for me. The key to the vault containing his will. The will that left $12 million entirely to me." Mateo squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a sharp, ragged breath. He rubbed his temples, the heavy silver watch glinting under the cafe lights. "Jerry," he began, his tone shifting into a placating, patronizing rhythm. "Listen to me. You don't understand the whole picture. You are looking at a few pieces of paper and jumping to conclusions." "I am looking at a forged signature," I corrected, my voice cold, devoid of emotion. "A legal waiver dated on my 18th birthday, surrendering my entire inheritance to Hector and Patricia. A signature that is a blatant, clumsy forgery." Mateo leaned across the table, his face inches from mine. The scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating. "Keep your voice down," he hissed. "Are you trying to ruin everything?" "Ruin what?" I challenged. "The pristine Rodriguez family image? The automotive logistics empire funded by my stolen money? They did it to protect the business, Geraldine," he snapped, the words tearing out of him. The confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I stared at my brother. The golden child, the perfect son. He was not a naive beneficiary. He was a fully complicit co-conspirator. "Protect the business." I repeated the syllables, tasting like ash on my tongue. "By stealing $12 million from their own daughter." Mateo raked a hand through his carefully styled hair, his composure completely shattered. "You have to understand the context, Jerry. 10 years ago, the company was hemorrhaging cash. Dad over-leveraged the expansion into Ohio. We were weeks away from bankruptcy. If word got out, the investors would have pulled out, the suppliers would have demanded upfront payment, the entire empire would have collapsed." "So they stole my grandfather's estate to cover their debts," I summarized, the cold reality settling deep into my bones. "They borrowed it," Mateo argued, his desperation palpable. "They used the trust assets as collateral to secure bridge loans. It saved the company. It saved our lifestyle. It saved everything we built." "Everything you built," I corrected. "I was archiving public records for poverty wages while you were driving a Porsche. I was living in a studio apartment while you bought a downtown condo. You funded your lavish lifestyle with my stolen inheritance." Mateo flinched, the accusation landing perfectly. He looked down at the table, refusing to meet my gaze. "Dad always intended to pay it back. He was going to set up a discreet trust for you once the company stabilized." "Liar," I said simply. "If he intended to pay it back, he wouldn't be trying to burn the portrait. He wouldn't be trying to sever the chain of custody. He wouldn't have forged my signature. The signature was a necessary evil, Mateo pleaded, grasping at straws. You were 18. You were naive. You didn't understand corporate finance. If Dad had told you about the money, you might have made a rash decision. You might have compromised the company. The audacity of his justification took my breath away. They didn't just steal my money. They rationalized it by diminishing my intelligence by treating me as an incompetent child incapable of managing my own life. A necessary evil, I repeated, the cold fury rising in my chest. Mateo reached across the table, covering my hand with his. His skin was clammy, his grip desperate. Jerry, please, if you go public with this, if you challenge the waiver, you will destroy the family. The scandal will ruin the company. Dad will face criminal charges. I will lose my position. Everything will be gone. I pulled my hand away, disgusted by his touch. It was never yours to begin with. Mateo's expression hardened, the desperation morphing into a cold, calculating resolve. He pulled a sleek leather checkbook from his jacket pocket. He uncapped a silver pen, his hand moving quickly across the paper. He tore the check out, sliding it across the coffee-stained table. $50,000, he said, his voice flat, professional. I will pay off your student loans. I will cover your rent for the next 5 years. You can quit your freelance archival work and travel. You can finally be independent. I looked at the check, the numbers written in his neat, confident handwriting. $50,000. A fraction of the fortune they had stolen from me. A bribe, I said quietly. An arrangement, he corrected. You take the money, you walk away, and you forget you ever saw those bank documents. We all go back to our normal lives. My normal life, I said, standing up from the stool, is being cropped out of family photos. My normal life is being the invisible disappointment while you play the golden heir. I am done being invisible, Mateo. I didn't touch the check. I turned and walked toward the exit, my boots clicking against the polished concrete floor.
Jerry?
Mateo called out, his voice laced with panic. Jerry, wait! If you fight Dad, he will crush you. He controls everything. You cannot win this. I pushed through the glass doors, the cold Detroit wind hitting my face. I didn't look back. I was entirely alone in this fight. My father was a thief. My mother was an accomplice. My brother was a complicit beneficiary who thought he could buy my silence for a pittance. I had no family left. I had only adversaries. I walked toward my parked sedan, my mind racing. Mateo was right about one thing. Hector controlled everything. He had the money, the lawyers, the corporate connections. If he realized I knew about the forged waiver, he would not hesitate to destroy me. I needed to act quickly. I needed to find a legal shark, someone ruthless enough to take on Hector Rodriguez and dismantle his pristine empire. I reached my car, unlocking the door. I slid into the driver's seat, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. The test was over. The battle had begun, and Hector was about to find out exactly how much damage a ghost could do. The drive back to Grand Rapids was a blur of gray highway and mounting adrenaline. I merged onto Interstate 96, pushing my rusted sedan faster than I had in years. My hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather cold against my palms. Mateo had revealed the depth of the betrayal. My parents had stolen my grandfather's $12 million estate, using it as collateral to save Rodriguez Logistics from bankruptcy. They had forged my signature on a legal waiver, treating my entire existence as a corporate asset. And Mateo, the golden child, was not just oblivious, he was complicit, living in a luxury condo funded by my erasure. I needed a strategy. Hector controlled a massive logistics empire. He had corporate attorneys, political connections, and a ruthless instinct for survival. I had a few photographs on my cell phone and a brass key. I was a freelance historical archivist, My professional life consisted of sorting through dusty municipal records and preserving forgotten documents. I was meticulous, but I was not a litigator. I needed to find a lawyer who specialized in estate fraud, someone who could dismantle the Rodriguez empire piece by piece. But to hire a lawyer, I needed access to funds. I needed to move the little money I had from freelance projects into a secure account outside my parents' reach. I took the exit toward my neighborhood, the familiar streets feeling suddenly foreign. I pulled into the parking lot of a local grocery store, needing supplies before I retreated to my apartment to plan my next move. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I tossed a few essentials into a basket: bread, peanut butter, instant coffee, fuel for the long nights ahead. I reached the checkout lane, setting my items on the conveyor belt. The cashier, a teenager with a bored expression, scanned the barcodes. "That will be $24.50, she said, popping a bubble of gum. I swiped my debit card through the reader. The machine beeped, a sharp, discordant tone. The screen flashed a single red word: declined. I frowned, pulling the card out and wiping the magnetic strip against my jeans. "That cannot be right," I murmured. "Try it again." I inserted the chip. The machine processed for 3 seconds before beeping again. "Declined. Please contact your financial institution." The teenager sighed, shifting her weight. "Do you have another card?" she asked, her tone laced with impatient pity. I dug through my wallet, my heart starting to race. I had $15 in cash. I handed it to her, returning the coffee and the bread to the shelf. I walked out of the store, holding a jar of peanut butter, my mind spinning. I had just deposited a payment for a municipal archiving job 2 days ago. There should have been at least $2,000 in my checking account. I sat in my car, pulling out my phone. I dialed the customer service number for my bank. The automated voice prompted me to enter my account details. When the system read my available balance, the electronic voice felt like a physical blow. "Your available balance is $0.00." A cold sweat broke across my forehead. I pressed 0, connecting to a human representative. A woman answered, her voice bright and professional. "How can I help you today?" "My card was just declined," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The system says my balance is 0, but I just deposited a check on Tuesday." The representative tapped on her keyboard. "Let me pull up your account, Miss Rodriguez." She paused, the clicking stopping abruptly. I see. A fraud alert was placed on your account approximately 45 minutes ago." "A fraud alert?" I repeated the words, tasting like ash. "Placed by whom?" The representative hesitated. "The alert was initiated by the joint account holder, Hector Rodriguez." My chest tightened, restricting the air to my lungs. The joint account holder. A memory surfaced sharp and clear. I was 18, standing in the kitchen preparing to leave for college. Hector had handed me a stack of banking forms, telling me he was setting up a joint student account to help me manage my finances. He framed it as an act of paternal generosity. He told me it would allow him to transfer emergency funds quickly. I signed the paperwork without reading the fine print, believing my father was looking out for my best interests. He had never removed his name. He had maintained joint access to my primary checking account for 10 years. A silent financial tether waiting to be pulled. And he had just pulled it. He withdrew the remaining balance I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes, Miss Rodriguez," the representative confirmed. The funds were transferred to an external account, and a hold was placed on the routing number due to suspected 2020 activity. You will need to visit a branch with the joint account holder to lift the restriction. I hung up the phone, tossing it onto the passenger seat. Hector knew. Mateo must have called him the second I walked out of the roasting plant. They knew I was digging, and they were moving with terrifying speed to cut off my resources. I put the car in drive, peeling out of the parking lot. I needed to get to my apartment. I had a few $100s hidden in a lockbox and a credit card that Hector did not co-sign. I could pack a bag, grab my laptop, and find a cheap motel until I figured out my next move. I sped down the suburban streets, running a yellow light as I turned into my apartment complex. I parked haphazardly, leaving the engine running. I sprinted up the concrete stairs to the second floor, my keys jingling in my shaking hand. I reached my door and stopped. Taped to the center of the dark green wood was a bright yellow notice. The color practically vibrated in the dim hallway light. I stepped closer, pulling the paper free. The header read, "Notice of lease termination and eviction." I scanned the typed text, the legal jargon blurring together before snapping into terrifying focus. The property management company was terminating my lease, effective immediately, due to the withdrawal of the primary financial guarantor. Hector. He had co-signed my lease 3 years ago when I decided to transition to full-time freelance work. My income had been unpredictable, and the landlord required a backer. Hector had offered, framing it as another act of fatherly support. It was never support. It was a leash. He had frozen my bank account and canceled my lease in the span of an hour. He was systematically dismantling the fragile, independent life I had built. He wanted to starve me out, force me back to the pristine house in Grand Rapids, force me to submit to his control. I unlocked the door, pushing it open. My apartment was small, cluttered with archival boxes and research books. It was not much, but it was mine, and Hector was taking it away. I did not have time to panic. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began throwing clothes inside: jeans, sweaters, heavy socks. I went to the lockbox under my bed, retrieving the emergency cash and my passport. I packed my laptop, the charger, and the external hard drive containing my historical research. I zipped the bag, grabbing my winter coat. I cast one last look around the small apartment, the home I was being forced to abandon. Hector thought he could break me by cutting my financial lifelines. He thought the quiet, introverted daughter would crawl back asking for forgiveness. He underestimated how much a ghost learns to survive in the dark. I ran down the stairs, throwing the duffel bag into the trunk of my car. I got into the driver's seat, locking the doors. I needed to get out of Grand Rapids. The city was Hector's territory. He knew the local police, the property managers, the business owners. I needed to head north into the dense pine forests of the Upper-Lower Peninsula. There were cheap motels along the highway, places that accepted cash and did not ask questions. I merged onto US 131, heading north. The suburban sprawl slowly gave way to rolling farmland and thick clusters of evergreen trees. The sky darkened, the bruised gray clouds finally delivering on their promise of snow. Heavy white flakes began to fall, swirling chaotically in the beam of my headlights. I drove for 2 hours, the tension in my shoulders radiating into my neck. I needed to find a lawyer. I needed to find the notary who stamped the forged waiver. I needed to fight back. I reached for my phone resting in the cup holder. I planned to search for estate litigators in Detroit, people who operated outside Hector's sphere of influence. I tapped the screen. Nothing happened. I pressed the power button, holding it down. The screen remained black. I grabbed the charging cable, plugging it into the port. The battery icon did not appear. I stared at the black rectangle of glass, my heart stalling in my chest. The phone was completely dead. It had 50% battery when I left the apartment. A sudden, sickening realization washed over me. Hector paid my cell phone bill. He had always insisted on keeping me on the family plan. He claimed it was cheaper, more efficient. It was another small, subtle way he maintained control over my life. He had not just frozen my bank account and canceled my lease. He had contacted the cellular provider and terminated my line. He had remotely bricked the device. I was driving through a remote Michigan forest in a snowstorm. I had no access to my money. I had no home to return to, and now I had no way to communicate with the outside world. I could not call for a tow truck if my car broke down. I could not search for a motel. I could not look up the address of a lawyer. Hector had effectively silenced me. He had plunged me into a complete blackout. The snow fell harder, accumulating on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. The dark pine trees loomed on either side of the highway, pressing in like silent, menacing sentinels. I gripped the steering wheel, the cold leather biting into my skin. This was the power of Hector Rodriguez. He did not need to use physical violence to destroy a person. He simply erased their resources. He erased their connections. He erased their ability to exist in the modern world. I was stranded in the dark financially, starved and completely isolated. The terror I had been holding at bay finally broke through, gripping my chest with icy claws. Hector had won the first battle. He had stripped me of everything I relied on. But as I stared out into the swirling snow, the terror slowly morphed into something else. Something cold and sharp and unbreakable. Hector had taken away my money, my apartment, and my phone. But he had not taken the photographs of the forged waivers stored on my laptop. He had not taken the knowledge of the $12 million trust. He thought a blackout would force me into submission. He was about to learn that when you plunge an archivist into the dark, they just learn how to read the shadows. The snow stopped falling shortly after sunrise, leaving the world buried under a thick, blinding layer of white. I had spent the night in a dilapidated motel off Interstate 75, paying for the room with the damp cash from my lockbox. The heater rattled violently against the wall, doing little to combat the freezing draft seeping through the window frame. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the black rectangle of my dead cell phone. Hector had stripped me of my resources, forcing me into a total blackout. But he had underestimated my ability to navigate without them. I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, I needed a predator. Someone who operated in the elite circles of Detroit and understood how to dismantle a corporate titan like Hector Rodriguez. I could not use the internet to find one, but I had something better. I had the memory of a conversation from the gallery. I opened my laptop, the battery icon showing 60%. I pulled up the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the forged waiver and the $12 million will. I transferred them to a flash drive, wrapping it in a tissue and sliding it into the front pocket of my jeans. I packed my duffel bag, leaving the dead cell phone on the bedside table. I did not need it. I drove back into Detroit, the morning traffic crawling through the unplowed slush. The city skyline emerged from the winter haze, a jagged silhouette of steel and glass. I navigated the familiar route back to Vanguard Fine Arts, parking my rusted sedan in an alley behind the building. The gallery was quiet, the exhibits closed to the public as the staff prepared for the upcoming retrospective. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the sudden warmth of the lobby washing over my frozen skin. Felix was standing near the reception desk, directing a team of art handlers. He looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from mild irritation to genuine surprise. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, setting his clipboard down. "You look terrible." "I imagine I do, Felix. I have been sleeping in my car for the last few hours, after my father froze my bank accounts and canceled my cell phone." Felix exhaled sharply, his eyes widening. "He has escalated. He is trying to silence me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He forged a legal waiver 10 years ago, stealing my grandfather's $12 million trust. The painting is the only thread left connecting me to that estate, and he is trying to burn it. I need a lawyer, Felix. You told me the executor of this estate operates outside my father's reach. You know people in this city. I need a litigator who eats men like Hector Rodriguez for breakfast." Felix stared at me, the calculation evident in his sharp gaze. He understood the gravity of the situation, the sheer magnitude of the theft. He reached into his blazer, pulling out a sleek silver business card. "Her name is Naomi," he said, sliding the card across the counter. "She is the senior partner at a firm specializing in contested estates and corporate fraud. She is brilliant. She is expensive, and she is utterly devoid of sentimentality. Tell her I sent you." I took the card, reading the address stamped in raised ink. "Thank you, Felix." I left the gallery, the silver card burning a hole in my pocket. Naomi operated out of a high-rise in the financial district, a towering monolith of dark glass that looked down upon the city. I walked through the revolving doors, shivering slightly in my worn winter coat. The lobby was a cavern of polished granite and hushed efficiency. I approached the security desk, presenting the silver card. The guard nodded, swiping a badge and directing me to the private elevator bank. The elevator ascended smoothly, stopping on the 35th floor. The doors opened, revealing a reception area that radiated intimidating wealth. Abstract art hung on pristine white walls. The receptionist, a woman with a severe bob and immaculate posture, looked up as I approached. "I do not have an appointment," I said, holding up the silver card. "Felix, from Vanguard Fine Arts, sent me. I need to speak with Naomi." The receptionist eyed my disheveled appearance, then glanced at the card. She picked up her phone, dialing a single extension. "Miss Rodriguez is here. Vanguard referral." She hung up, gesturing toward a set of frosted glass doors. "She is expecting you." I pushed through the doors, entering a corner office that offered a panoramic view of the frozen Detroit River. The room was stark, devoid of personal touches. Behind an expansive glass desk sat a woman in her late 40s. She wore a tailored crimson blazer, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot. Her eyes, dark and calculating, locked onto me the moment I entered. "Have a seat, Miss Rodriguez," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Felix called ahead. He said you are claiming your father committed multi-million-dollar trust fraud?" I sat down the leather chair, sighing under my weight. I placed the flash drive on the glass desk. "Claiming implies a lack of evidence, Naomi. I am stating a fact." Naomi picked up the flash drive, sliding it into her laptop. "Show me." I guided her through the photographs I had taken in the credit union vault. I showed her the $12 million will, the property deeds, the transfer documents. Then I pulled up the forged waiver. "Look at the signature," I said, pointing to the screen. "My name is Geraldine. The loops on the G are hesitant, the tail of the Z is dragged. It is a clumsy forgery executed on my 18th birthday. Hector and Patricia used this document to seize the entire estate." Naomi studied the image, her expression unreadable. She zoomed in on the signature, examining the pixelated ink. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city far below. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "You have a compelling narrative, Geraldine. A wealthy, controlling father, a quiet archivist's daughter, a hidden masterpiece. It plays well. But a compelling narrative is not legal proof." I frowned, leaning forward. "The signature is clearly fake. A handwriting expert can prove it." Naomi shook her head, a grim smile touching her lips. "Proving forgery after 10 years against a prominent citizen like Hector Rodriguez is incredibly difficult. Handwriting experts can be contested. Defense attorneys will argue that your signature simply evolved over the decade, or that you signed it under duress and are now seeking revenge. A mismatched signature is enough to raise suspicion, but it is not enough to dismantle a corporate titan in a court of law." My chest tightened. The cold panic I had felt on the highway threatened to return. "What do we need then?" "We need the original notary logbook," Naomi said, her voice dropping a fraction of an inch. "The waiver was notarized. The notary stamp is the legal seal that validates the document. If we can prove the notary stamped that waiver without you being present, we prove the fraud. We prove Hector orchestrated the entire deception." I stared at the screen, the image of the forged signature blurring slightly. How do we find a notary logbook from 10 years ago? Naomi typed a few keystrokes, bringing up the Michigan State Registry database. She zoomed in on the notary seal stamped beneath the forged signature. The name Mitchell was faintly legible in the blue ink. "You are an archivist," she said, locking her dark eyes onto mine. "You track down forgotten records for a living. I need you to find Mitchell. I need you to secure his logbook or sworn affidavit confirming the fraud. Without it, we have a theory. With it, we have a guillotine." I swallowed hard, the magnitude of the task settling heavily on my shoulders. "I can find him." Naomi closed the laptop, her expression hardening. "You need to move fast, Geraldine. Felix informed me that your father filed a motion for an emergency injunction to seize and destroy the portrait. The hearing is scheduled for this coming Friday." The ticking clock. Hector was moving the timeline forward, trying to eliminate the evidence before I could mount a defense. "We have 4 days," I whispered, the reality of the deadline crashing over me. 4 days, Naomi confirmed. 4 days to find a notary who has likely been bribed or threatened into silence. 4 days to secure the logbook and draft a countermotion that will shatter your father's pristine empire. She opened a desk drawer, pulling out a massive black legal binder. She slapped it onto the glass desk, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet office. "I work on contingency," Naomi stated, opening the binder. "If we win, I take a substantial percentage of the recovered trust. If we lose, you owe me nothing. But understand this, Geraldine. Hector Rodriguez will not fight fair. He will use every resource, every connection, every dirty trick he has acquired in his corporate career to crush you. He will try to destroy your reputation, your sanity, and your future. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at the black binder, then at the panoramic view of the frozen city. Hector had already tried to starve me out. He had frozen my accounts, canceled my lease, and cut my phone line. He had treated my existence as a corporate asset to be managed and erased. I reached across the desk, taking the pen Naomi offered. I signed the retainer agreement, my signature sharp and distinct. "I am an archivist, Naomi," I said, my voice steady, ringing with a cold, unyielding fury. "I specialize in bringing buried history into the light. Hector thinks he can hide his crimes in the dark. Let him try." Naomi smiled, a predatory gleam in her dark eyes. "Let us go hunting, then." I left Naomi's towering glass office, feeling a strange mixture of terror and invincibility. The clock was ticking. 4 days to find Mitchell the notary. 4 days to secure the logbook and draft an injunction that would halt my father's ruthless machine. The snow had stopped, but the Detroit wind was unforgiving, whipping my coat against my legs as I hurried back to my hidden car. I turned the ignition, the heater struggling to push lukewarm air into the freezing cabin. I had a direction now. I had a legal shark on my side. But as I navigated the slush-filled streets back toward the highway leading north, my newfound confidence collided with the brutal reality of Hector Rodriguez's reach. I needed to start hunting for Mitchell. I pulled into a fast food restaurant parking lot, stealing their free wireless internet signal. I opened my laptop, the battery hovering at 40%. Without my cell phone, this was my only tether to the world. I logged into my email, hoping to find a response from a former archivist colleague who might have access to state registry databases. Instead, my inbox was flooded. 30 new emails had arrived in the last 2 hours. The sender names were a relentless march of my past. Aunts, uncles, family friends, former high school classmates, people I had not spoken to in years. I clicked on the first one from my Aunt Clara. "Geraldine, please come home. Your mother is beside herself. We all know you are struggling right now, but extorting your family is not the answer. Get the help you need. I frowned, opening the next email. This one from a local historian I occasionally collaborated with. Jerry, I heard about your episode. I am so sorry you are going through a mental health crisis. We will need to pause our current project until you are stable. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I opened Facebook, a platform I rarely used. My feed was dominated by a single post. Patricia Rodriguez had tagged 30 people in a lengthy emotional statement. Friends and family, she wrote, her digital voice dripping with practiced maternal anguish. It breaks my heart to share this, but our daughter Geraldine is experiencing a severe psychiatric breakdown. She has severed contact with us and is currently suffering from delusions, claiming we owe her money. She is lashing out at Hector and me, threatening our business and our safety. Please keep her in your prayers, and if she reaches out to you, please do not engage with her paranoia. Direct her back to us so we can get her the medical intervention she desperately needs. I stared at the glowing screen, the words blurring together. A psychiatric breakdown, delusions, extortion. They were not just freezing my bank accounts. They were incinerating my reputation. This was the Whisper campaign. Hector and Patricia were utilizing their deep, ingrained ties in the Grand Rapids community to preemptively discredit me. They knew the truth would eventually surface. They knew the Vanguard Gallery exhibit was a ticking time bomb. So they were setting the stage. They were ensuring that when I finally spoke, no one would listen. I would not be the victim of a multi-million-dollar trust fraud. I would be the unstable, greedy daughter having a manic episode. I scrolled through the comments beneath Patricia's post. Hundreds of them. Country club members, logistics executives, local politicians offering their sympathy, praising my parents' strength in the face of such a tragedy. My own brother Mateo had commented, "We love you, Jerry. Please come back to us." The sheer audacity of it made me physically nauseous. They were weaponizing my lifelong introversion, framing my quiet nature as the precursor to a mental collapse. They were painting themselves as the tragic victims of a disturbed child. I slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet car. The isolation was absolute. Hector had severed my finances, my communication, and now my social standing. I was entirely alone, an outcast in my own life. I put the car in drive, pulling back onto the highway, heading toward the cheap motel I had booked for the night. The drive was a blur of white snow and dark pine trees. The psychological weight of the smear campaign pressed down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. Every mile I drove further north felt like a retreat. They were winning. They were always winning. I reached the motel, a dilapidated single-story structure with a flickering neon sign. I paid for another night with cash, retrieving a physical key from a bored clerk behind bulletproof glass. The room smelled of stale smoke and harsh cleaning chemicals. The thin walls offered no insulation against the freezing wind howling outside. I sat on the sagging mattress, pulling my knees to my chest. The silence in the room was deafening. I had spent my entire life trying to be invisible, trying not to disrupt my parents' perfect narrative. And now, when I finally decided to step into the light, they were using that very invisibility against me. Who would believe the quiet, messy archivist over the polished, wealthy titan of industry? The despair was a physical ache pulling me downward, urging me to surrender. I could call Hector from a payphone. I could accept the $50,000 bribe Mateo offered. I could walk away and disappear. It would be so easy to just vanish. I opened my laptop again, the battery indicator flashing red. I needed to focus. I needed to find Mitchell, the notary. But my eyes kept drifting to a folder on my desktop labeled Family Archive. Over the years, I had digitized hundreds of old physical photographs, attempting to preserve the history my parents were so desperate to curate. I clicked the folder, opening the image files. There they were, the pristine timeline. Vacations, galas, holidays. Hector Patricia Mateo. Smiling, radiant, perfect. And there I was. Or rather, there I was not. I clicked through the images, studying the edges of the frames. A shoulder cut off, a sliver of dark hair hovering on the periphery, a shadow cast on the grass where I had been standing before the crop tool was applied. For 20 years, I looked at these photos and felt shame. I believed the lie that I ruined the aesthetic, that my presence disrupted their flawlessness. But as I stared at the digital images, the harsh motel lighting illuminating the screen, the symbolism shifted entirely. The cropped photos were no longer a testament to my lack of beauty. They were a visual map of a crime. Hector and Patricia had not cropped me out because I slouched. They cropped me out to minimize my footprint in the world. They were building a narrative where I was a non-entity, a ghost. If I did not exist in the family photos, if I did not exist in the public record, it would be infinitely easier to forge my signature and steal $12 million without anyone asking questions. The photos were not proof of my inadequacy. They were proof of their premeditation. The despair that had been suffocating me evaporated, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They wanted to paint me as an unstable extorter. They wanted to silence me with a whisper campaign. But I was an archivist. I knew that history always leaves a paper trail. And I was about to find the man who held the most important piece of paper in this entire twisted saga. I closed the image viewer and opened the state registry database. I needed to find Mitchell. I needed the logbook, and I needed to deliver a guillotine to Hector Rodriguez. The winter sun offered no warmth as I drove further north. The landscape transitioning from suburban sprawl to dense, unforgiving pine forests. The silence in the car was absolute, save for the rhythmic thud of the tires against the salted asphalt. I had spent the last 2 hours cross-referencing the notary stamp I photographed in the vault with property records and historical address registries. My archival skills, honed over years of tracking down obscure municipal data, were finally serving my own survival. I found a match. Mitchell, the notary, who validated my forged signature 10 years ago, had relocated to a remote cabin near Traverse City shortly after my 18th birthday. The timing was not a coincidence. Hector had likely paid him off, ensuring the only witness to the forgery was geographically isolated and financially secure. The 2-lane highway narrowed, winding through towering evergreens heavy with fresh snow. The isolation was palpable. There were no cell phone towers, no gas stations, just an endless expanse of white and green. I gripped the steering wheel, the adrenaline from the gallery meeting warring with the sheer physical exhaustion of sleeping in a freezing car. I was chasing a ghost, a man who had sold his integrity to Hector Rodriguez, and I had to convince him to risk everything by testifying against a corporate titan. I turned onto a deeply rutted dirt road, the suspension of my rusted sedan protesting violently. The trees closed in, creating a dark tunnel that felt completely disconnected from the rest of the world. After 3 miles, the trees broke, revealing a small log cabin sitting on the edge of a frozen lake. A plume of gray smoke drifted from the stone chimney. I parked the car, the engine ticking as it cooled. The air outside was bitter, biting through my thin coat the moment I stepped out. I walked toward the heavy wooden door, my boots crunching loudly against the packed snow. I did not knock immediately. I stood on the porch, steadying my breathing, rehearsing the arguments I would use to break a man who had hidden for a decade. I raised my fist and knocked 3 sharp times. The silence stretched. I knocked again, louder. The heavy thud of footsteps approached from inside. The door opened a fraction, restrained by a thick brass chain. A man in his late 60s peered through the crack. His face was weathered, lined with deep grooves. His eyes darted from me to the empty driveway behind me, scanning the tree line with practiced paranoia. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Are you Mitchell?" I asked, matching his cautious tone. He hesitated, the chain rattling slightly as he adjusted his grip on the door. "Who is asking?" "My name is Geraldine Rodriguez." The color drained from his weathered face. He stepped back, the heavy door swinging shut. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. "Mitchell!" I shouted, pressing my palms against the frozen wood. "Mitchell! Do not lock me out! I know what Hector did. I know about the waiver." The silence from inside was deafening. I pounded on the door, the sound echoing across the frozen lake. "He is trying to burn my grandfather's painting," I yelled, my voice cracking with the strain. "He is trying to destroy the only piece of my history I have left. You helped him steal my future. You owe me 5 minutes." The deadbolt clicked. The door swung open slowly, revealing Mitchell standing in the dim entryway. He looked older now, his shoulders slumped, his expression a mixture of profound guilt and terror. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. The cabin was small, heated by a roaring fire in the stone hearth. It smelled of wood smoke and stale coffee. Mitchell walked to the kitchen counter, pouring a cup of dark liquid from a battered percolator. He did not offer me one. "He knows you are here," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Hector, he knows everything." "Hector does not know I am here," I replied, stepping closer to the fire, letting the heat thaw my frozen hands. "He froze my accounts and cut my phone. He thinks I am stranded." Mitchell let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "Hector Rodriguez never leaves a loose end, Miss Rodriguez. If you found me, he will find me." I pulled my laptop from my bag, setting it on the small wooden dining table. I opened the screen, navigating to the folder containing the high-resolution photographs. I turned the laptop toward him. "Look at this," I commanded softly. Mitchell approached the table reluctantly. His eyes landed on the image of the forged waiver. He stared at his own notary stamp, validated by his own signature, dated 10 years ago. His hands began to shake, the coffee sloshing over the rim of his mug. I did not know what it was he whispered, shaking his head. "Your father told me it was a standard trust transfer. He said you were traveling abroad and could not be present. He offered me $50,000 to stamp the document. I needed the money. My wife was sick." $50,000. The exact amount Mateo had offered me as a bribe. That was the price Hector put on my life. "Look at the signature, Mitchell," I said, pointing to the screen. "Look at the hesitant loops. Look at the dragged tail on the Z. Hector forged my name. He stole $12 million, and he used your stamp to make it legal." Mitchell squeezed his eyes shut, turning away from the screen. "I cannot help you. Hector will ruin me. He has corporate lawyers, judges on his payroll. If I testify, he will destroy what little life I have left." I reached into my bag, pulling out the flash drive containing the images from the Vanguard gallery. I plugged it in, pulling up the photograph of the true heir. The image filled the screen, the 8-year-old girl staring defiantly out into the dim cabin. I spun the laptop around again. "Look at her." Mitchell opened his eyes. His gaze locked onto the painting. The panic in his expression softened, replaced by a deep, sorrowful recognition. "My grandfather painted that," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "He painted me. And right now, Hector is filing an emergency injunction to have this canvas seized from a gallery and incinerated. He is going to burn this because it is the only proof that I exist outside of his control." Mitchell stared at the painted eyes, his shoulders trembling. "I knew your grandfather," he murmured. "He was a good man. He came to my office once before he died. He told me he was leaving everything to you. He told me to watch out for Hector, then honor his memory. I pleaded, Naomi, my lawyer says we need the original logbook. We need proof that you stamped that waiver without me in the room. If we have that, we can stop the injunction. We can stop Hector. Mitchell stood frozen, the firelight dancing across his weathered face. The silence in the cabin stretched, the weight of a decade-old crime pressing down on both of us. He looked at the painting, then at the forged waiver, then finally at me. He walked toward a heavy oak bookshelf in the corner of the room. He reached behind a row of dusty encyclopedias, pulling out a thick, leather-bound ledger. He carried it to the table, setting it down with a heavy thud. The state requires notaries to keep these logs for 10 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I kept this one longer. I knew this day would come. He opened the ledger, flipping through the yellowed pages until he reached a specific date. He pointed a shaking finger at a blank line next to the entry for the Hollister Trust transfer. There is no signature, he said. You never signed the logbook, because you were never in my office. Hector brought the document already signed. I stared at the blank line, a profound sense of vindication washing over me. The paper trail was complete. I need you to state that on camera, I said, pulling my laptop closer and opening the recording software. I need a sworn affidavit, Mitchell, right now. He nodded, sinking into the chair opposite me. He looked defeated, but the terror in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet resolve. I started the recording. Mitchell spoke clearly, detailing the date, the $50,000 bribe, and the explicit instructions Hector provided. He held the logbook up to the camera, showing the blank signature line. He confessed to the fraudulent notarization, providing the exact testimony Naomi needed to shatter my father's pristine narrative. When the recording stopped, I saved the file to 3 separate secure locations. I closed the laptop, sliding it back into my bag. Thank you, Mitchell, I said. He did not look up from the table. Do not thank me until Hector is behind bars, Miss Rodriguez. He will not surrender quietly. I walked out of the cabin, the freezing northern wind hitting my face. I had the logbook tucked securely under my arm. The drive back to Detroit would take hours, but the despair that had crushed me the previous night was gone. Hector thought a whisper campaign and a financial freeze would break me. He thought I would vanish into the snow. I unlocked my car, throwing my bag onto the passenger seat. I had the weapon I needed. The wall of lies had finally cracked. But as I merged back onto the highway, heading south toward the city, I could not shake the feeling of impending dread. Hector was a titan. Titans do not fall without causing catastrophic collateral damage. I had secured the evidence of the forgery, but the puzzle felt incomplete. Hector had stolen my inheritance, but how had he managed to control my life so absolutely for the next 10 years, without me ever needing to sign another legal document? The answer was waiting in Naomi's towering glass office, and it was about to change the entire trajectory of my existence. The drive back to Detroit was a race against a clock I could not see. The winter sun was already dipping below the horizon by the time I navigated the familiar route back to the financial district. I had the notary logbook, the physical evidence of the forgeries, safely tucked into my bag. Hector had built his empire on the illusion of control, but I was returning to the city with a sledgehammer aimed directly at his foundation. The fatigue was bone deep, but the adrenaline kept my hands steady on the steering wheel. I parked the car and hurried through the freezing wind, pushing through the revolving doors of Naomi's high-rise. The security guard waved me through, his expression impassive. I took the elevator to the 35th floor, the silence in the cab pressing against my ears. When the doors opened, Naomi's office was still lit, a beacon of relentless legal machinery operating long past normal business hours. Naomi was standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the glittering city lights. She held a stack of papers, her posture tense. I have it, I said, stepping into the office and placing the heavy logbook onto the glass desk. Mitchell gave a videotaped affidavit. He confessed to the bribe. The signature line is blank. The forgery is undeniable. Naomi turned from the window, but the triumphant expression I expected was missing. Her dark eyes were unreadable. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She walked over to the desk, picking up the logbook. She glanced at the blank entry, then set it aside with a deliberate, almost weary motion. "This is a solid piece of evidence, Geraldine," she said, her voice quiet, too quiet. "It proves your father bribed a state official and falsified a document." I frowned, the victory I had felt on the drive down rapidly evaporating. But I asked, bracing myself for the inevitable complication. "But it is a smokescreen," Naomi replied. She picked up the stack of papers she had been holding and handed them to me. They were copies of court documents, heavily redacted, the black ink obscuring chunks of text. "While you were tracking down Mitchell, I initiated a deep audit of the Hollister Trust transfer history," Naomi explained. "I subpoenaed the records from the remote county jurisdiction where the trust was originally established. I was looking for the paper trail connecting the forged waiver to the actual transfer of the $12 million. I stared at the documents, the dense legal jargon blurring before my eyes. "What did you find?" Naomi leaned against the edge of the glass desk, her arms crossed. "I found out why Hector never needed your signature after you turned 18. I found out why he was able to co-sign your lease, control your bank accounts, and manage your life with absolute authority." My chest tightened, a suffocating weight settling over my lungs. "He is my father. He insisted on maintaining those accounts." "He did not insist, Geraldine. He mandated it legally." Naomi tapped the top document with a perfectly manicured fingernail. "Look at the header." I forced my eyes to focus on the text. The words seemed to rearrange themselves, forming a sentence that defied comprehension. "Petition for appointment of conservator and declaration of incapacity." I read the title again, the letters searing into my brain. Declaration of incapacity. The petitioner was listed as Hector Rodriguez. The respondent, the individual deemed incapable of managing her own affairs, was Geraldine Rodriguez. My hands began to shake, the papers rustling violently. "What is this?" I whispered. Naomi watched me, the clinical detachment of a litigator softening into something resembling pity. "10 years ago, on your 18th birthday, your parents did not just forge a waiver to steal your inheritance. They filed a highly specific remote county financial conservatorship. They submitted fabricated medical evaluations claiming you suffered from severe cognitive impairments and psychiatric instability. They convinced a judge that you were legally incompetent to manage your own life." The room spun, the towering skyline outside the window tilting dangerously. I gripped the edge of the desk, steadying myself against the sudden vertigo. "They declared me incompetent." I repeated the words, tasting like poison. Naomi nodded slowly. "Hector was appointed your permanent financial conservator. That is why your signature was never required for any subsequent bank transfers. The state recognized him as your legal proxy. He had total, unmitigated control over every dollar you inherited and every dollar you earned." The puzzle pieces slammed together, the resulting picture so horrifying it stole the breath from my body. The forged waiver was just a distraction, a secondary layer of deception in case anyone ever questioned the initial transfer. The true crime, the ultimate betrayal, was the conservatorship. I thought about the last 10 years. I thought about the freelance archiving projects, the late nights spent researching obscure historical records, the pride I felt when I secured my own apartment. I thought I was building an independent life. I thought I was carving out a small, quiet space in the world that belonged entirely to me. But I was never independent. I was a legal fiction. That is why the Vanguard Gallery plaque listed me as deceased, I said, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Yes, Naomi confirmed. When Hector tried to suppress the exhibit, he could not simply claim you objected. A competent adult can change their mind. An incompetent adult under conservatorship, however, is a liability. He provided the gallery with a fabricated death certificate, leveraging the privacy laws surrounding conservatorships to keep the executor from verifying the truth. He declared you dead to the art world to maintain the illusion that the subject of the painting no longer existed. The Whisper campaign, the sudden influx of emails from relatives claiming I was having a psychiatric breakdown, it was not just a social smear. It was a calculated maneuver to reinforce the lie they had told the court 10 years ago. They were laying the groundwork to justify the conservatorship if I ever managed to challenge it. They did not just steal my money, I said, my voice devoid of emotion, a cold, hollow echo in the vast office. They stole my autonomy. They stole my legal existence. Naomi walked around the desk, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. Hector is a predator, Geraldine. He viewed your inheritance as a corporate asset to be acquired, and he viewed you as a logistical obstacle to be neutralized. He structured this conservatorship specifically to ensure you could never fight back, because in the eyes of the law, you do not have the capacity to hire a lawyer or file a lawsuit. I looked up at her, the shock morphing into a terrifying crystalline clarity. But I hired you. Naomi smiled, a sharp, predatory expression. You did. And because I am operating on contingency, and because you signed this retainer agreement before the court formally notified me of your conservatorship status, we have a small, highly contentious window of attorney-client privilege. What happens now? I asked. Now Hector realizes that the forgery is the least of his problems, Naomi said, moving back to her computer terminal. I have drafted an emergency motion to dissolve the conservatorship, citing gross misrepresentation and medical fraud. But Hector will not wait for a judge to rule on this. He knows that if this conservatorship is exposed, his pristine reputation will be annihilated. The automotive elite in this city tolerate ruthless business tactics, but they do not tolerate men who medically gaslight their own children for profit. The phone on Naomi's desk began to ring. A harsh, intrusive sound that shattered the quiet intensity of the room. She glanced at the caller ID, her expression hardening. "Speak of the devil," she murmured. She pressed the speaker button, the line clicking open. Naomi speaking? The voice that filled the office was smooth, cultured, and completely devoid of the panic I expected. It was Hector Rodriguez. "Counselor," he began, his tone dripping with arrogant condescension. "I understand you have been having unauthorized contact with my daughter." Naomi leaned into the microphone, her posture radiating absolute authority. "I am currently representing Geraldine Rodriguez in a matter concerning trust fraud and conservatorship abuse, Hector." A low chuckle emanated from the speaker. "You are representing a legally incompetent adult who is currently experiencing a severe manic episode. Any retainer agreement she signed is invalid. I am her conservator. I speak for her. She is sitting right here." "Hector," Naomi replied, her voice cold enough to freeze the Detroit River. "She is perfectly lucid, and we have the notary logbook proving you forged her signature 10 years ago." There was a brief pause on the line, the silence heavy with calculation. The arrogant facade cracked just a fraction. "You are playing a dangerous game," Naomi Hector said, his voice dropping into a menacing register. "You are attempting to dismantle a family structure you do not understand. Geraldine requires specialized care. Her current actions are a symptom of her condition, not a reflection of reality." I leaned forward, the anger roaring in my ears, drowning out the fear. "I am not sick, Hector," I said, my voice carrying across the desk. I am not incompetent, and I am not hiding in the background anymore. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the speaker. Geraldine, you need to come home. You are confused. I am not coming home, I replied. I am coming for the $12 million you stole. The silence stretched the tension vibrating through the office. Hector realized the intimidation tactics were failing. The ghost had not just refused to vanish. It had acquired teeth. We need to meet, Hector finally said, his tone shifting from menacing to transactional. We need to resolve this privately, before your firm wastes any more billable hours on a frivolous lawsuit. Where? Naomi asked. A neutral location, Hector replied. A mediation room at the downtown Marriott, tomorrow morning at 9. I will bring Mateo. We can discuss a settlement that ensures Geraldine's continued care, without the necessity of a public spectacle. Naomi looked at me, raising an eyebrow in a silent question. I nodded, the cold resolve hardening into an unbreakable diamond. We will be there, Naomi confirmed. The line disconnected, leaving the dial tone echoing in the quiet office. Hector thought he could summon me to a sterile conference room and negotiate my existence. He thought he still held the power. He wants to offer a settlement, I said, staring at the dead phone. He wants to bribe me. He is terrified, Geraldine, Naomi said, closing the legal binder. He knows the conservatorship is a house of cards. He is hoping you are still the quiet daughter who will accept a fraction of what you are owed just to avoid a confrontation. I stood up, the fatigue completely gone, replaced by a fierce, burning energy. I am going to walk into that mediation room, Naomi. I am going to look Hector Rodriguez in the eye, and I am going to watch him realize that he no longer controls the narrative. Naomi smiled, picking up her briefcase. Good, because while he is busy trying to negotiate a bribe, I will be filing the emergency injunction that will freeze every single asset in the Rodriguez logistics empire. The trap was set. Hector thought he was walking into a negotiation. He had no idea he was walking into an execution. The downtown Marriott was a monument to corporate anonymity. The lobby was a vast expanse of polished granite and muted lighting designed to make everyone feel equally unimportant. I stood near the entrance, clutching the strap of my messenger bag, the ambient noise washing over me. Hector had chosen this location deliberately. It was neutral territory, a place where business was conducted and emotions were liability. He expected me to arrive terrified, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the environment he navigated daily. Naomi stepped through the revolving doors a few minutes before 9. She wore a tailored navy suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. Her expression was a mask of professional indifference, but I could see the predatory glint in her dark eyes. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low and steady. I took a deep breath, the sterile air filling my lungs. "I am ready." We took the elevator to the 5th floor, walking down a long, carpeted hallway to a private conference room. The heavy oak doors were closed. Naomi did not knock. She pushed the handles down and stepped inside the room, commanding the space instantly. Hector and Mateo were already seated at a long mahogany table. The room offered a panoramic view of the Detroit skyline, but neither of them was looking out the window. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. The loving father facade, the paternal concern he had projected over the phone, was gone. This was Hector Rodriguez, the titan of logistics, the man who crushed competitors and orchestrated a 10-year legal illusion. Mateo sat beside him, looking uncharacteristically tense. The relaxed confidence he displayed at the roasting plant had vanished, replaced by a nervous energy. He tapped a silver pen against a leather folio, refusing to meet my gaze. Hector did not stand when we entered. "Have a seat, Geraldine," he said, gesturing to the empty chairs opposite him. I pulled out a chair, sitting down and resting my hands on the polished wood. Naomi sat beside me, opening her briefcase and extracting a single manila folder. I understand you have retained counsel, Geraldine Hector continued, his tone smooth, patronizing. But I think we can all agree this is a family matter that does not require the theatrics of a courtroom. Naomi leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. This ceased to be a family matter, Hector, when you filed a fraudulent conservatorship to seize $12 million of my client's inheritance. Hector's expression did not change. His dark eyes remained locked on me, ignoring Naomi entirely. You are confused, Geraldine. You have been struggling for a long time. Your mother and I have only ever acted to protect you. The financial arrangements we made were necessary to ensure your long-term care. I stared at the man who had raised me, the man who had systematically dismantled my life to fund his empire. Protect me. I repeated the word, tasting like acid. You declared me legally incompetent. You told a judge I was incapable of managing my own affairs, so you could use my grandfather's trust as collateral for your failing business. Mateo cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. Jerry, please. You do not understand the corporate side of this. The company was going under. Dad made a difficult decision to save all of us. Save all of you? I countered, keeping my voice level. You live in a luxury condo, Mateo. You drive European sports cars. You funded your entire life with money that belonged to me, while I scraped by archiving municipal records. Hector raised a hand, silencing Mateo. Let us dispense with the emotional rhetoric, Geraldine. You are angry. I understand that. But anger does not alter reality. The reality is I am your legal conservator. The reality is, any action your lawyer attempts to take will be tied up in litigation for years. I have the resources to drag this out until you are bankrupt. The sheer arrogance of his threat was staggering. He sat there, a man who had committed massive fraud, believing his wealth made him untouchable. He thought he could bully me into submission, leveraging the very legal system he had corrupted. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. So, what is your proposal, Hector? A tight, satisfied smile touched his lips. He believed the intimidation was working. He reached into his jacket pocket, extracting a sleek leather checkbook. He uncapped a gold fountain pen and began to write. I am prepared to offer a substantial settlement, he said, his voice taking on a transactional rhythm. A lump sum payment transferred directly to a secure trust that you control. In exchange, you will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a formal ratification of the current estate structure. He tore the check from the ledger, sliding it across the polished mahogany table. The slip of paper stopped exactly in front of me. $500,000, Hector stated. That is more money than you have ever seen, Geraldine. It is enough to buy a house, travel, start your own archival business. You can be entirely independent. I looked down at the check. The numbers were written in his neat, precise handwriting. $500,000. 10 times the amount Mateo had offered me at the coffee shop. Hector thought he was being generous. He thought he was offering me a fortune. The irony was almost unbearable. He was offering me a fraction of my own money, a bribe funded by the very trust he had stolen. I placed my index finger on the edge of the check, slowly sliding it back across the table. The paper drifted across the polished wood, stopping inches from Hector's folded hands. You owe me $12 million, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, deadly register. Hector's smile vanished. The facade cracked, revealing the ruthless predator beneath. You are making a massive mistake, Geraldine. You think this lawyer can save you? You think a few photographs of a bank document mean anything in the real world? If you reject this offer, I will freeze every asset you possess. I will ensure you never work in this state again. I will crush you. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back. For 20 years, I had allowed this man to dictate my worth. I had allowed him to crop me out of the picture. But the ghost had acquired teeth, and I was no longer afraid of the dark. I have a notary logbook, Hector, I said, matching his intensity. I have Mitchell's sworn videotaped affidavit detailing the $50,000 bribe you paid him to stamp a forged waiver. The color drained from Mateo's face. He dropped his silver pen, the metal clattering loudly against the table. Hector remained completely still, his dark eyes boring into mine. A forgery allegation requires a competent plaintiff, Geraldine. You are under a legal conservatorship. A judge will dismiss your claims as the paranoid delusions of a psychiatric patient. You have no standing. Naomi cleared her throat, a sharp, precise sound that cut through the tension. Actually, Hector, she does. Naomi opened the manila folder, extracting a thick stack of legal documents. She slid them across the table, the papers fanning out in front of my father. Hector looked down, the confident, arrogant posture finally breaking. That is a notice of emergency injunction, Naomi stated, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Filed 30 minutes ago in the Federal District Court. Hector snatched the top document, scanning the legal text. His hands began to tremble slightly. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "We did not just file a motion to dissolve the conservatorship," Naomi explained. "We filed a civil RICO claim detailing a coordinated, decade-long conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. We submitted the notary affidavit, the forged waiver, and the fabricated medical evaluations you used to establish the conservatorship." Mateo pushed his chair back, standing up abruptly. "Dad, what does this mean?" "It means," Naomi continued, her gaze locking onto Hector, "that the federal judge was highly disturbed by your actions. The injunction was granted immediately." Hector's chest heaved, the realization of his catastrophic miscalculation finally crashing over him. "Effective as of 10 minutes ago," Naomi stated, closing her briefcase. "Every single corporate and personal account tied to Rodriguez Logistics is frozen. Your credit lines are suspended. The assets you used to secure your bridge loans are locked. The financial chokehold you attempted to place on my client has been completely reversed." The silence in the conference room was absolute. The titan of industry, the man who believed his wealth made him invincible, sat paralyzed, staring at the legal documents that signaled the end of his empire. "You set a trap," Hector whispered, his voice hoarse. "You built the cage." "Hector," I replied, standing up from the table. "I just locked the door." I turned and walked out of the conference room, Naomi following close behind. I did not look back. The sterile hallway felt different now. The oppressive weight of Hector's control had lifted, replaced by a fierce, burning momentum. The financial freeze was just the first strike. The true destruction, the total annihilation of their pristine public image, was scheduled for tomorrow night. The Vanguard Gallery was preparing for an exhibition, and I was going to ensure the entire automotive elite witnessed the masterpiece Hector tried to burn. The air in Detroit felt different the morning after the mediation trap. The oppressive, heavy winter sky seemed to have lifted slightly, letting a pale, watery sunlight filter through the gray clouds. I sat in a booth at a diner near Naomi's office, a cup of black coffee warming my hands. The caffeine buzzed in my veins, but it was the adrenaline of the looming legal strike that kept me wide awake. Hector thought he had cornered me in that sterile conference room. He thought his $500,000 bribe and his arrogant threats would force me back into the shadows. He did not realize the shadows were exactly where I had learned to fight. My phone, the burner device I had purchased after Hector bricked my original line, vibrated against the Formica table. It was Naomi. The federal judge just signed the order, she said, her voice devoid of its usual clinical detachment, replaced by a fierce, triumphant energy. The injunction is active, Geraldine. The conservatorship is suspended pending a full criminal investigation, and the asset freeze has been executed across all identified financial institutions. A long, slow exhale escaped my lungs, carrying with it 10 years of invisible chains. The legal fiction Hector had constructed, the lie that I was an incompetent invalid, incapable of managing my own existence, was officially broken. "How fast does the freeze happen?" I asked, watching the morning commuters hurry past the diner window. "In the modern banking system," Naomi replied, "it is virtually instantaneous. Hector is about to have a very difficult morning." She was right. The financial chokehold Hector had used to systematically dismantle my life, canceling my lease, freezing my checking account, cutting my phone line, was now reversed with devastating precision. The federal injunction hit the Rodriguez logistics empire like a wrecking ball. 50 miles away in Grand Rapids, the facade of the perfect suburban family began to collapse. Patricia Rodriguez was a woman whose entire identity was predicated on social standing and visible wealth. Her morning routine was a carefully choreographed display of status. She drove her pristine, imported SUV to the elite country club where she held court over breakfast with the wives of other automotive executives. It was the epicenter of the Whisper campaign, the place where she had tearfully painted me as an unstable, extorting daughter. She approached the hostess desk, handing over her Platinum Club card to cover the exorbitant monthly dining tab. The hostess swiped the card. The machine beeped a sharp, discordant tone. The screen flashed a red error message. Declined. Patricia, annoyed but maintaining her polished smile, handed over a secondary credit card. The hostess swiped it. Declined. The polished veneer cracked. Patricia demanded the hostess try a third card, a corporate account tied directly to Hector's logistics firm. The machine rejected it with finality. "I am sorry, Mrs. Rodriguez," the hostess murmured, her voice carrying across the quiet, elegant dining room. "All of these accounts appear to be frozen." The surrounding tables went silent. The wives who had offered Patricia their sympathy regarding my alleged psychiatric breakdown now stared with barely concealed judgment. In their affluent circle, financial instability was a far greater sin than poor parenting. Patricia's pristine public image shattered right there on the imported marble floor. The Whisper campaign she had launched to discredit me died instantly, replaced by a vicious, rapidly spreading scandal about the Rodriguez family finances. Meanwhile, downtown Mateo was experiencing his own catastrophic reality check. The Golden Child, the vice president of regional distribution, arrived at his luxury condo building after a morning workout. He parked his expensive European sports car in the private garage. As he walked toward the elevator, a man in a dark jacket approached him, holding a clipboard. "Mateo Rodriguez?" the man asked. Mateo frowned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yes?" The man handed him a thick envelope. Notice of repossession. The financing on this vehicle was secured using assets from the Hollister Trust, which are currently under a federal freeze due to suspected fraud. "I need the keys." Mateo, the brother who had smugly told me that Dad basically owned me, the brother who had tossed a $50,000 bribe across a coffee shop table, suddenly found himself standing in a concrete garage, stripped of the superficial wealth he had claimed as his own. The empire he thought he was destined to inherit was evaporating before his eyes. And Hector, the Titan, the predator who viewed my existence as a logistical obstacle. He arrived at his corporate headquarters expecting to bully his legal team into finding a loophole. Instead, he found chaos. Suppliers were calling demanding upfront payments because the corporate credit lines had vanished. The bridge loans he had secured using my grandfather's trust as collateral were suddenly in default. The company he had built, the empire he had prioritized over his own daughter, was paralyzed. He tried to call his corporate attorneys, only to be informed that they could not represent him in a matter involving federal fraud and conservatorship abuse. Hector was isolated, trapped in the very cage he had spent 10 years building for me. I left the diner, walking toward Naomi's office building. The cold wind whipped off the river, but I did not shiver. The balance of power had completely shifted. My burner phone vibrated again. The screen displayed an unknown number, but the area code belonged to Grand Rapids. I answered, letting the silence stretch. Geraldine voice sobbed through the speaker. It was Patricia. The practiced suburban warmth was gone, replaced by a hysterical, desperate panic. Her breathing was ragged, her words tumbling over each other. "Geraldine, please," she cried. "You have to stop this. The country club canceled my membership. The bank is threatening to foreclose on the house. Hector is screaming at the lawyers. You do not understand what you are doing." I kept walking, my boots clicking a steady rhythm against the concrete pavement. "I understand exactly what I am doing, Patricia. You have to call off your lawyer," she pleaded, the desperation sharpening into something ugly and raw. "Hector forced me into this. He told me the business would go under if we did not use the trust. He made me sign the conservatorship papers. I am your mother, Geraldine. You cannot do this to me." I stopped at the corner, waiting for the crosswalk signal to change. I listened to her sobbing, to her frantic attempts to shift the blame, to cast herself as the victim of Hector's ambition. For 20 years, she had told me I did not photograph well. She had systematically cropped me out of family portraits, erasing my presence to maintain a flawless narrative. She had helped declare me legally incompetent, treating my life as a disposable asset. And now, when the consequences of her actions finally arrived, she demanded mercy she had never offered. "I am going to the Vanguard Gallery tomorrow night, Patricia," I said, my voice cold, devoid of the anger that had consumed me for the last week. "The opening reception for my grandfather's retrospective, the unveiling of the true heir." The crosswalk signal chirped, changing from a red hand to a white walking figure. I pulled the phone away from my ear. Patricia's hysterical voice was still spilling from the speaker, begging, pleading, bargaining. I hovered my thumb over the red icon. I did not listen to the end. I pressed end call, silencing her permanently. I stepped into the crosswalk, moving toward the towering glass high-rise where Naomi was preparing the final strike. Hector and Patricia were financially ruined, their social standing obliterated, their golden child stripped of his stolen luxury. The financial chokehold was complete, but the destruction was not finished. Hector had tried to burn the painting to hide the evidence of my existence. He had tried to silence me in the dark. The final confrontation, the ultimate reckoning, was not going to happen in a sterile courtroom or a private mediation suite. It was going to happen in the center of the Detroit Art District, under the glaring track lighting of the Vanguard Gallery. Hector and Patricia were going to watch me step into the light, and they were going to do it in front of the exact elite society they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. The ghost had hauled them into the light, and the spotlight was about to turn blinding. The Detroit night sky was a vast expanse of bruised purple clouds, reflecting the harsh amber glow of the city streetlights. A bitter wind whipped off the river, carrying the sharp scent of impending snow, but I felt impervious to the cold. I stepped out of the hired town car onto the pavement outside Vanguard Fine Arts. The building had transformed since my last visit. The quiet industrial cavern was now a beacon of warmth and light. Valet attendants in dark coats hurried to open the doors of idling luxury vehicles. The exact demographic my parents worshipped was currently funneling through the heavy glass doors of the gallery. For 20 years, I had dressed to disappear. I had worn oversized sweaters and muted colors, blending into the background of every family event. Tonight, I wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, the fabric draped perfectly, armor forged for a battle they never expected me to fight. I walked up the concrete steps, my posture straight, my breathing slow and measured. The ticking clock had reached 0. The injunction was active. The financial freeze had suffocated the Rodriguez empire. The only thing left was the unveiling of the truth. I pushed through the doors, the sudden heat of the lobby rushing over me. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted espresso, and the sharp effervescence of poured champagne. The room was packed. Art critics holding small notepads mingled with local politicians, automotive executives. The men and women Hector had spent decades trying to impress stood in tight circles discussing market shares and overseas logistics. This was the elite echelon of Michigan society, a closed loop of wealth and influence. Felix waited near the reception desk. He wore a velvet dinner jacket, his silver hair catching the track lighting overhead. When he saw me, a genuine smile broke across his usually guarded face. "You made it," he said, his voice carrying over the ambient hum of the crowd. "I would not miss this, Felix," I replied. He offered me a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. "The rumors are already circulating, Geraldine. The freeze on your father's company leaked to the financial press an hour ago. Half the people in this room are currently whispering about Rodriguez Logistics. They are waiting for a statement. They have no idea the real story is standing right in front of them." I took the glass, the cool condensation grounding my hands. Let them whisper. Tonight is not about Hector's company. Tonight is about my grandfather. Felix nodded, gesturing toward the center of the exhibition hall. The towering canvas was positioned perfectly, drawing the eye of everyone who entered the space. It was draped in heavy black velvet, concealing the painted girl waiting beneath. The brass plaque that once declared "My Death" had been removed, leaving only a blank space on the pristine white wall. The ambient noise began to lower as Felix walked toward a small podium set up near the draped canvas. He tapped the microphone, the sharp feedback echoing off the exposed brick. The crowd turned their attention, shifting toward the center of the room. The automotive barons and the society wives fell silent, holding their crystal flutes in quiet anticipation. "Welcome, Felix," began his voice smooth and commanding. "Tonight, Vanguard Fine Arts is profoundly honored to present the final retrospective of a man who rejected the traditional confines of the art world. He was a recluse, a visionary, and a master of capturing the defiant spirit of his subjects. He painted strictly for himself, holding his greatest works in a private trust far away from public consumption." I stood near the front of the crowd, watching the faces of the audience. They were captivated, leaning forward to catch every word. "The centerpiece of tonight's exhibition," Felix continued, "is a portrait he considered his magnum opus. It was entrusted to an independent executor with specific instructions. It was to remain hidden until the subject came of age to claim it. For years, rumors circulated regarding the fate of the girl on the canvas. Some claimed she was a fiction. Others claimed she had passed away in her youth." Felix looked directly at me, his gaze steady and respectful. "But art has a remarkable way of preserving the truth, even when the world attempts to paint over it. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the unearthing of a hidden legacy. I present the true heir." He reached out, grasping the edge of the black velvet drape. With one smooth motion, he pulled the heavy fabric away. The crowd let out a collective, breathless gasp. The track lighting illuminated the 6-foot canvas. The 8-year-old girl in the sunlit garden stared out at the elite of Detroit, her dark, tangled hair and sharp, defiant eyes commanding the cavernous room. The sheer scale of the painting, combined with the visceral, raw emotion captured in the oil paint, held the audience spellbound. Then the whispers began. Not about the brushstrokes or the composition. The whispers started as people in the front row shifted their gaze from the painted girl to the woman in the charcoal suit standing mere feet away from the canvas. The resemblance was undeniable. The sharp slope of the jaw, the untamed dark hair, the unyielding stare. The ghost had materialized. Before the realization could fully settle over the room, the heavy glass doors at the front of the gallery crashed open. The sharp sound shattered the reverent silence. The cold winter wind rushed into the lobby, extinguishing the warmth. Hector Rodriguez stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his pristine tailored suit looking slightly rumpled for the first time in his life. Patricia stood beside him, clutching a designer handbag, her face a mask of panicked desperation. Mateo flanked them, his usual golden boy confidence entirely eradicated, leaving only the frantic energy of a cornered animal. The trio pushed past the protestations of the valet attendants, stepping into the crowded exhibition hall. The guests parted instinctively, creating a wide path. The whispering that had started regarding the painting morphed into a chaotic, buzzing hum. These were Hector's peers, his golf partners, his investors. They had spent the entire afternoon reading urgent financial briefs about the sudden, inexplicable freezing of his corporate assets. Now, they watched the titan of logistics crash an art premiere, looking unhinged. Hector locked eyes with me. The physical distance between us felt charged, thick with a toxic electric tension. He marched down the center of the room, his heavy footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. Patricia followed close behind, her heels clicking frantically. They reached the front of the crowd, stopping mere feet from the podium. Hector did not look at the painting. He did not look at the masterpiece my grandfather had created. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on me, blazing with a furious, terrifying intensity. Geraldine hissed, his voice low enough to avoid the microphone, but loud enough for the first 3 rows of guests to hear every syllable. "This ends right now." I did not shrink back. I stood my ground, the massive portrait of my younger self looming directly behind me, serving as an unbreakable visual anchor. "I am afraid you are too late, Hector," I replied, my voice calm, carrying the cold detachment he had taught me. "The exhibit is already open." Patricia stepped forward, reaching out with a trembling hand. Her eyes darted nervously toward the society wives, watching her every move. "Geraldine, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured maternal sorrow. "You are sick. You do not know what you are doing. You are destroying your own family. Come home with us so we can get you your medication." The sheer audacity of the lie delivered in front of the very people she was trying to manipulate sent a shockwave of disgust through my veins. She was attempting to revive the Whisper campaign using the crowd as her audience, hoping social pressure would force me to surrender. Mateo moved closer, his jaw clenched tight. "Jerry," he warned, his tone laced with venom. "Dad is not playing around anymore. The lawyers are drafting a countersuit right now. You drop this insane delusion, or you are going to spend the rest of your life locked in a ward." I looked at my brother, then at my mother, then, finally, at the man who had orchestrated the theft of my existence. They were financially frozen, legally trapped, and socially bleeding. Yet they still believed they could intimidate me into silence. They still believed they held the power because I had spent 20 years letting them dictate my reality. I turned my back to them for a fraction of a second, reaching toward the podium. Felix stepped aside, offering a silent nod of support. I wrapped my hand around the cold metal of the microphone, lifting it from the stand. Hector realized what I was about to do. The furious arrogance in his eyes fractured, replaced by genuine, unadulterated panic. "Do not do this, Geraldine," he ordered, stepping forward, his hands curling into tight fists. "You put that down right now." I turned back to face him, the microphone gripped tightly in my hand. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the lighting fixtures above us. Hundreds of pairs of eyes watched, waiting for the next move. The elite society my parents worshipped stood in judgment. I looked Hector Rodriguez directly in the eye, breathing in the cold air that had swept through the open doors. The time for private meditations and silent endurance was over. The ghost was holding a microphone, and she was about to haunt the room. The microphone felt heavy in my hand, cold and unyielding. The hum of the gallery, the nervous murmuring of the automotive elite, the clinking of crystal glasses, everything faded into a profound, rushing silence. Hector stood less than 5 feet away, his chest heaving, his dark eyes burning with a desperate, panicked fury. Patricia was beside him, her face pale, her expensive silk scarf trembling against her throat. Mateo hovered just behind them, his golden boy facade entirely shattered. For 20 years, they had controlled the narrative. They had curated the family photos, they had managed the whisper campaigns, they had orchestrated the legal fictions, they had built a fortress of pristine reputation, and they expected me to remain the quiet, invisible daughter trapped in the basement of their empire. But I was standing in the center of the Vanguard Gallery. The track lighting illuminated the magnificent oil painting behind me, casting a long, sharp shadow across the polished concrete floor. My grandfather had painted me as a defiant 8-year-old girl, and tonight, I was going to ensure his masterpiece was the last thing Hector Rodriguez saw before his empire collapsed. Patricia lunged forward, her manicured hand reaching out to grab my forearm. "Geraldine!" she cried, her voice cracking, perfectly pitched to elicit sympathy from the watching crowd. "Please, sweetheart, you are not well. You need your medication. Let us take you home." Her fingers brushed the sleeve of my charcoal suit. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I brought my free hand up and firmly, deliberately pushed her arm away. The rejection was sharp, visible to every single person in the room. Patricia stumbled back, a look of genuine shock crossing her face. The loving mother performance had failed to break me. "Do not touch me, Patricia," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone, echoing off the exposed brick walls. The sheer volume of my voice commanded the space, forcing the elite society crowd to lean in, their expressions shifting from polite concern to rapt, horrified attention. Hector stepped forward, his jaw clenched tight. "Geraldine," he warned, his tone dropping into that menacing register he used to crush corporate rivals. "You are making a spectacle. Put the microphone down and walk out of this building before you do irreparable damage." I looked at him, the man who had filed the fraudulent conservatorship, the man who had bribed a notary to steal $12 million, the man who had remotely bricked my cell phone while I was driving through a freezing pine forest. "You are the one who caused the damage, Hector," I said, my voice steady, ringing with a cold, absolute clarity. "You just spent the last 24 hours trying to figure out why your corporate accounts were frozen, why your bridge loans are in default, why the federal government suddenly placed an emergency injunction on every asset tied to Rodriguez Logistics." The whispers in the crowd erupted again, louder this time. Automotive barons and logistics executives exchanged alarmed glances. The rumors that had been circulating all evening were suddenly being confirmed, loudly and publicly. Hector froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking old and hollow. "You have no idea what you are talking about," he spat, attempting to maintain his authority. "You are legally incompetent. Your lawyer is a parasite, feeding off your delusions." "I am not legally incompetent, Hector." I countered the words, cutting through the air like a guillotine blade. "I am the victim of a multi-million-dollar fraud. 10 years ago, on my 18th birthday, you and Patricia filed a fraudulent financial conservatorship in a remote county court. You submitted fabricated medical evaluations, claiming I suffered from severe psychiatric instability. You convinced a judge that I was incapable of managing my own life." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Patricia covered her mouth with her trembling hand. Matteo looked down at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the people he had spent years trying to impress. "You did this," I continued, my voice rising, carrying the weight of a decade of erasure, not to protect me, but to steal my grandfather's estate. "You used the conservatorship to bypass my signature. You bribed a notary named Mitchell to stamp a forged waiver surrendering $12 million of historic real estate and trust assets directly into your control. You used my inheritance as collateral to save your failing logistics company." Hector opened his mouth to speak, to deny the allegations, to spin another lie, but the words died in his throat. The faces of the crowd, the people he worshipped, the elite society he had prioritized over his own daughter, were staring at him with undisguised revulsion. They tolerated aggressive business tactics, they respected ruthless ambition, but medical gaslighting and stealing from a child crossed a boundary even they could not ignore. "You spent 20 years cropping me out of family photos," I said, my gaze locking onto Patricia. "You told me I did not photograph well, but you were not preserving an aesthetic. You were establishing a narrative. You were trying to minimize my footprint in the world, so that when you declared me legally incompetent and stole my future, no one would ask any questions." Patricia began to sob openly, tears ruining her meticulous makeup. She reached out toward the wives in the front row, the women she had shared breakfast with at the country club, the women she had fed the Whisper campaign to. But they stepped back, pulling their expensive coats tighter around their shoulders, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout. "And when you found out about this portrait," I said, turning my attention back to Hector, "when you realized my grandfather had bypassed your control and left a masterpiece with an independent executor, you panicked. You filed an injunction to have this canvas seized and incinerated. You provided the gallery with a fabricated death certificate claiming I passed away 10 years ago. You tried to burn the only piece of my history I had left because you knew the painting would lead me to the truth." Hector stood paralyzed, the arrogant titan completely dismantled. The federal injunction had frozen his finances, but the public exposure was destroying his legacy. The poetic justice was absolute. The destruction was not happening in a private mediation room or a sterile courthouse. It was happening here, in the center of the Detroit Art District, under the glaring track lighting, surrounded by the exact people he had sacrificed his soul to impress. Felix stepped up to the podium, signaling to the gallery security team. Two burly guards in dark suits moved swiftly through the crowd, approaching Hector, Patricia, and Matteo. "Mr. Rodriguez," Felix said, his voice projecting quiet authority, "you and your family are no longer welcome in Vanguard Fine Arts. Please escort them out." Hector looked at the security guards, then at the disgusted faces of his peers, then finally at me. The realization of his total, comprehensive defeat settled over him. The empire was gone. The reputation was ashes. The ghost had not just haunted the room, she had brought the entire fortress crashing down. He did not argue. He did not threaten me. He simply turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors. His shoulders slumped, his pristine suit looking heavy and oversized. Patricia followed him, still sobbing, her silk scarf trailing behind her. Matteo walked slightly apart from them, head down, the golden child stripped of his stolen luster. The gallery doors closed behind them, sealing them out in the freezing Detroit night. The silence in the exhibition hall was profound. Hundreds of people stared at me, the woman in the charcoal suit standing before the massive oil painting. I took a slow, deep breath, the scent of linseed oil and polished concrete filling my lungs. I placed the microphone back on the stand. I turned around, facing the canvas. My grandfather had painted me with defiant clarity, demanding that the world acknowledge my existence. He had given me the brush and told me never to let anyone paint over me. The crowd began to applaud. It started as a slow, hesitant clapping from the front row before swelling into a thunderous, roaring ovation. It echoed off the exposed brick, washing over me in a wave of validation and triumph. I did not smile. I did not bow. I simply stood there, the canvas towering behind me, firmly anchored in the present. The fraud was exposed, the empire was shattered. But the true victory was not the destruction of Hector Rodriguez. The true victory was the reclamation of my own narrative. The legal battles would continue. The criminal charges would be filed. The millions would eventually be restored. But tonight, in the blinding light of the gallery, I had accomplished the most important task of all. I was finally in the picture. 6 months later, the Detroit winter had finally surrendered to the pale, humid warmth of early summer. I sat at a large drafting table, the morning sunlight streaming through the arched industrial windows of my new office. The space was a renovated warehouse in downtown Grand Rapids. The exposed brick and polished concrete felt expansive, open, unburdened by history. I held a delicate archival brush, carefully sweeping away decades of dust from a municipal ledger. The physical space belonged to me. The building, the foundation, the archives, all of it funded by the complete restoration of the Hollister Trust. The fallout from the gallery premiere had been catastrophic and absolute. The elite automotive society Hector had spent his life cultivating abandoned him the moment the scope of the fraud became public. They tolerated cutthroat business tactics, but medical gaslighting and stealing from a child crossed a boundary that even the most cynical executives found repugnant. The legal dismantling of the Rodriguez empire was swift and brutal. Naomi operated with terrifying efficiency. The federal judge dissolved the fraudulent conservatorship, immediately restoring my legal autonomy. The civil RICO claim we filed unspooled the intricate web of bridge loans and fabricated accounts Hector had used to secure his logistics company. Hector Rodriguez, the titan who had viewed my existence as a disposable asset, was currently facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud and perjury. His pristine reputation was entirely annihilated. Patricia, the woman who had cried in the gallery begging for mercy she never offered me, filed for divorce in a desperate attempt to shield her personal assets from the federal seizure. It did not work. She lost the suburban fortress, the imported porcelain, the country club membership. She moved into a small leased condominium, her social standing obliterated. Mateo, the golden child, was forced to declare bankruptcy. The luxury vehicles, the downtown condo, the lifestyle funded by my stolen inheritance were repossessed and liquidated to satisfy the massive judgments levied against my parents' estate. He reached out once, leaving a long, rambling voicemail, attempting to apologize, claiming he was manipulated by Hector. I deleted it without responding. I did not gloat over their destruction. I did not experience a profound, cinematic catharsis watching them lose everything. The reality of severing ties with your family, even a toxic, corrupted family, is a quiet, heavy grief. But it was a necessary grief. The excision of a rot that had infected my life for 28 years. I set the archival brush down, rolling my shoulders to release the tension. The heavy wooden door to my office clicked open. Felix stepped into the room holding a sleek, silver flash drive. He looked exactly as he had the night of the gallery premiere, wearing a crisp, tailored jacket, his silver hair impeccable. He had become a frequent visitor, helping me establish the preservation foundation I launched with the restored trust funds. The foundation was designed to provide grants and studio space for independent local artists, ensuring that no one ever had to compromise their vision to survive. "Good morning, Geraldine," he said, walking toward the drafting table. "The renovations look spectacular." "Thank you, Felix," I replied, gesturing to the exposed brick walls. "It feels right, preserving history instead of burying it." He set the flash drive on the He set the flash drive on the table. I received the final digital package from the photographer we hired for the Vanguard retrospective. I thought you might want the high-resolution files for your personal archive. I picked up the flash drive, the metal cool against my fingers. Thank you. Felix studied me, his expression softening. The gallery is rotating the exhibition next week. The True Air is scheduled to be moved to the permanent collection wing. It has been the most visited piece in the museum for the last 6 months. My grandfather's masterpiece, the beacon that had guided me out of the dark, was finally receiving the recognition he intended. Hector had tried to burn it. Patricia had tried to deny it. Matteo had tried to buy my silence regarding it, but the canvas had survived, outlasting the empire built on lies. I am glad people are seeing it, I said quietly. Felix nodded, a small, knowing smile, touching his lips. They are not just seeing the painting, Geraldine. They are seeing you. He turned toward the door, pausing before he exited. I will see you at the board meeting on Thursday. I watched him leave the heavy door clicking shut behind him. I sat alone in the sunlit office, the ambient noise of the city drifting through the large windows. I picked up the flash drive, rolling it between my fingers. For 20 years, my relationship with photographs had been defined by absence. The cherry wood frames lining the hallway of my parents' house had been a curated narrative of my exclusion. Patricia had told me I did not photograph well. She had systematically cropped me out, erasing my presence, minimizing my footprint in the world, to maintain the legal illusion of my incompetence. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop, the screen illuminating the polished wood of the drafting table. A folder appeared on the desktop, labeled Vanguard Premiere. I double-clicked the folder, opening the image gallery. The photographs were stunning, capturing the energy and the raw emotion of the exhibition night. I saw images of the crowded room, the automotive elite staring at the canvas. I saw Felix standing at the podium, delivering his speech. And then I saw the photograph, taken moments after Hector and Patricia were escorted out of the building. I clicked the image, maximizing it on the screen. The picture was taken from the back of the gallery, framing the massive oil painting in the center. Standing directly in front of the canvas was a woman in a sharply tailored charcoal suit. It was me. The lighting illuminated my face, capturing the exact moment the crowd began to applaud. I was not smiling, but my posture was straight, my shoulders squared, my eyes looking directly into the camera lens with the same defiant clarity my grandfather had painted into the 8-year-old girl towering behind me. I studied the edges of the frame. There was no Hector trying to control the angle. There was no Patricia complaining about the aesthetic. There was no Matteo demanding the center spot. There was only me, surrounded by people who respected me, anchored by the legacy my grandfather left me, standing firmly in a life I had fought to reclaim. I stared at the photograph, the quiet, heavy grief I had carried for 6 months finally dissolving, completely replaced by a profound, settling peace. The ghost had not just haunted the room. The ghost had become the architect of her own reality. I moved the cursor, right-clicking the image file. A drop-down menu appeared. I scrolled to the bottom, clicking Set as Desktop Background. The image filled the entire screen, covering the digital clutter, replacing the blank void with vibrant, undeniable proof of my existence. I leaned back in my chair, the morning sun warming my face. The archival records waited on the drafting table. The Foundation board meeting loomed on Thursday. The world was vast and open and entirely mine to navigate. I was finally in the picture, and no one would ever crop me out again. The family photo album sits on the mantelpieces and coffee tables of nearly every suburban home across America. It is presented as a chronological testament to success, a glossy record of holiday gatherings, graduation ceremonies, and summer vacations by the lake. We look at these framed moments and see the American dream, perfectly captured behind glass. But Geraldine's story forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What exists just outside the edge of the frame? What or who has been carefully cropped out to maintain the illusion of perfection? In reflecting upon the harrowing journey of a daughter erased by her own parents, we are confronted with a profound indictment of conditional love. In modern American culture, there is a dangerous, creeping tendency to view the family structure not as a sanctuary of emotional development, but as an extension of personal branding. For Hector and Patricia, their children were not individual souls to be nurtured. They were assets and liabilities on a corporate balance sheet. This is the dark underbelly of the achievement-obsessed American family. When the appearance of success becomes more important than the substance of genuine connection, the fundamental duty of a parent is entirely corrupted. True family responsibility requires an agonizing, relentless level of emotional awareness. It demands that parents look at their children and see them for exactly who they are, rather than who the parents need them to be to satisfy their own egos. Geraldine was quiet, introspective, and perhaps inconvenient to her parents' polished country club narrative. Instead of leaning into her unique nature, instead of providing the long-term guidance that honors a child's inherent worth, her parents pushed her into the shadows. They did not just neglect her, they weaponized her invisibility. This brings us to the devastating impact of abandoning fairness within the traditional family structure. The creation of the golden child dynamic is a tragedy that destroys everyone involved, even the one it seems to elevate. Mateo was placed in the center of every photograph, showered with unearned accolades and funded by a stolen inheritance. Yet, by clearing every obstacle from his path and shielding him from accountability, his parents did not raise a strong, capable man. They raised a fragile, morally bankrupt dependent who collapsed the moment true adversity arrived. Conversely, by starving Geraldine of affection and resources, they inadvertently forged a woman of unbreakable steel. Character, it seems, is rarely grown in the easy soil of entitlement. It is forged in the dark, cold spaces where a child is forced to become her own protector. Yet, we cannot romanticize Geraldine's suffering. The betrayal she endured highlights why absolute unyielding honesty must be the bedrock of any family. The horrifying revelation of the financial conservatorship, the legal declaration of her incompetence, was the ultimate lie. Parenting is at its core a sacred social contract. You are tasked with bringing a vulnerable life into the world, protecting them when they cannot protect themselves, and eventually giving them the tools to fly away and build a life of their own. Hector and Patricia inverted this contract. They clipped their daughter's wings, not to keep her safe, but to harvest her feathers to line their own luxurious nest. They stole her autonomy to fund their logistics empire, proving that when honesty is abandoned, the family home ceases to be a refuge and becomes a meticulously decorated prison. Geraldine's grandfather understood the antidote to this toxicity. Through his breathtaking oil portrait, The True Heir, he demonstrated the purest form of long-term guidance. He saw her. He did not ask her to smile perfectly or fit into a predetermined aesthetic. He handed her a paintbrush and told her she was the canvas, not the background. That is the essence of emotional awareness in parenting, offering a child the tools to paint their own reality, validating their existence even when it clashes with the parent's expectations. The grandfather's love transcended his death because it was rooted in truth, whereas the parent's control evaporated because it was built entirely on a foundation of lies. We tell these stories not merely to point fingers at the villains of a narrative, but to hold a mirror up to our own lives. How often do we subtly crop out the messy, complicated, or inconvenient truths of our own families to present a flawless face to the world? How often do we prioritize our own comfort or social standing over the difficult, messy work of truly understanding our children? If these hidden corners of the human heart resonate with you, if you find yourself questioning the narratives you have been handed and the frames you have been placed inside, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe and follow Intimately Told Stories. We will continue to explore the raw, unvarnished truths of family resilience and the quiet courage it takes to reclaim your own narrative. There are so many more stories left to uncover, and perhaps, in hearing them, you will find the language to tell your own. As we leave Geraldine standing victorious in the center of the Detroit Gallery, bathed in the light of her own reclaimed truth, we are left with a final, haunting realization about the nature of family. Conventional wisdom in American society dictates that family is everything. We are told from birth that blood is thicker than water, that we must forgive the transgressions of our kin, and that the ultimate goal is to keep the family unit intact at all costs. We are conditioned to believe that maintaining the family bond is the highest moral imperative. But perhaps that is the greatest lie we tell ourselves. Perhaps the truest act of emotional maturity is recognizing that blood does not automatically grant someone a lease on your soul. When the people tasked with protecting you become the very architects of your destruction, forgiveness is not a virtue, it is a self-inflicted wound. The profound, uncomfortable truth is this: the most radical, necessary act of self-love you can ever commit is sometimes looking at the family portrait you were excluded from, turning your back on it, and walking away. You do not owe your light to the people who were only ever comfortable keeping you in the dark.